In his palace inside the bottle, Han Sen's face was looking grim. He was sitting on the floor, frowning as he tried to think. He had never been as embarrassed as he was right then. He had needed a little girl to step in and save his life. If Gu Wanner hadn't stalled God's knife for him, he never would have had the chance to use the 4-sheep cube to escape. And he had even told Gu Wanner not to get in his way. But in the end, this was how things had turned out. He would never forget the expression on Gu Wanner's face when he had to leave her. I must find a way to defeat that crappy knife and bring Wanner back safely. Han Sen calmed himself and tried to think rationally. He knew feeling angry and embarrassed wasn't going to solve anything. He needed to find a way to sort out that so-called God's knife to save Gu Wanner. He needed to take her away from that place. If I use my super god spirit body, I shouldn't be harmed by super space slash. But even if Wanner and my super god spirit body didn't conflict with each other, my super god spirit body wouldn't last long. It couldn't support me long enough to defeat God's knife. So, how can I block super space slash while not using super god spirit body? Plus, on top of that, just blocking super space slash isn't enough. I need to find a way to counter and break God's knife itself. Even old blood dragon lady was unable to destroy its body, and my power will be far weaker than what she was capable of generating. It will be even harder for me to destroy its body. Han Sen wasn't going to give up just because of that, though. He took time to calculate every possibility of what might transpire there. There was still a sliver of a chance he could succeed, one which he calculated to be 1:10,000, but that wasn't going to sway his firm resolve. The immortal dragon had been healing Han Sen's body nonstop, but he had been taking too many injuries. When he was in God's farm, the immortal dragon could only heal each wound partially, leaving his body looking like a spider web of scars. That fight had injured him so much that he hadn't even known how badly he was injured. I can't change the past, so dodging is impossible, unless I can erase the past. At that thought, Han Sen's eyes brightened. Maybe I can try the Alpha Sit and Forget Sutra. The Sit and Forget Sutra is about looking for a way for the body to disconnect from the universe, so the user can reside in a space that is outside of time and space. If a person's power is disconnected from the universe, then the blood demon will be unable to see me in the past. That abides by the rules of the universe. Han Sen thought this was something he could try. He had the experience of the Alpha, so it wouldn't be difficult for him to practice the Sit and Forget Sutra. But even if the Sit and Forget Sutra could break super space slash, Han Sen still had no way of destroying God's knife. This would only allow him to avoid losing for an indeterminate amount of time. Han Sen couldn't think of a way in which he could destroy God's knife, but for now, he had a plan. First and foremost, he had to practice the Sit and Forget Sutra. He needed to see if he could break super space slash. Because he didn't have the very high sense as a base, Han Sen could only use his Under the Sky as a base. He put the Sit and Forget Sutra into a part of the Under the Sky knife skill. It had been 2 weeks, and Han Sen hadn't set one foot out of the palace. Ever since the old blood dragon lady appeared, Han Sen's body had no longer grown any scales, and the blood coral hadn't so much as twitched in all that time, either. If Han Sen hadn't seen it become the old blood dragon lady, he would have thought it was just an ordinary lump of coral. It looks like the drop of the old blood dragon lady's blood that I have wasn't enough to support her full rebirth. But that is fine. I don't know if she is a friend or foe, and so this is likely the best result for now. Han Sen looked at the chunk of blood coral next to him, and then he walked outside of the palace. For the past 2 weeks, he had been trying to let the Sit and Forget Sutra melt into his Under the Sky knife skills. But he had encountered a few problems he had been unable to overcome. He needed an idea or two, but there was nothing inspiring about that bottle palace. It was hard to come up with ideas. Han Sen walked around the palace in circles. He still didn't understand, and he felt a bit annoyed. Although he understood that he had to be calm right now, the thought of Wanner and her situation was driving him insane. He couldn't keep calm. He brought out the siren bottle and summoned the siren virgin. He spoke to her, hoping to get some ideas from her. The results were very disappointing for Han Sen once again, though. The siren virgin had never seen the super space slash before, so she couldn't think of a way in which he might be able to break it. After the Siren Virgin spent half a day spouting useless crap that he didn't need to hear, Han Sen had to put his foot down. He sent her back into the bottle and tossed her into storage. There was no one in that bottle palace to give Han Sen advice. After hesitating for a while, he eventually decided to enter Destiny's Tower. He was going to see Ancient Devil, who had been trapped there for the longest time. Currently, Ancient Devil was the only prisoner that Han Sen was keeping in Destiny's Tower. All the other creatures he once kept there had been sent to Purgatory Heaven a long time ago. Only Ancient Devil seemed too dangerous to be allowed to leave Destiny's Tower. You need something from me? Ancient Devil had been trapped there for a very long time, but he didn't look angry or restless like the average prisoner. It looked like he was on vacation, rather than trapped in an inescapable prison. Han Sen had to admire his attitude. If Han Sen had been trapped in there for so many years, he didn't think he would be so chill. I have encountered a creature that wields a super space/power. I don't know how to break it. Rather than trying to hide anything, Han Sen laid out what had happened as plain as could be. Ancient Devil's intelligence was remarkably high. He wasn't someone you could fool easily with a few lies, so Han Sen didn't even bother trying. That is easy. If you promise to let me go, I can teach you how to break it, Ancient Devil answered calmly. When he spoke about the conditions for his aid, he didn't sound excited about the prospect. Your powers are at the lowest tier of this universe, and my opponent is one of the most powerful beings in this reality. Do you really think I'm going to believe you? Han Sen asked coldly, staring at Ancient Devil. Yes, that is why you came, isn't it? Ancient Devil paused, and then went on to say, plus, strength and knowledge don't go hand in hand. Time and space in this universe are the same as time and space in other places. After all, they work the same here as they do in the sanctuaries. Super space/works the same as well. The reasoning behind it is the same. If you understand that, you can find a way to break it. Then tell me, how would you break super space/? Han Sen asked. Agree to my conditions first, Ancient Devil shot back. You have to at least prove to me that you can really break the super space/power, Han Sen said, while looking expressionlessly at Ancient Devil. That Ancient Devil guy was too dangerous. Han Sen wouldn't let him out unless he had no other option. This had nothing to do with Ancient Devil's strength. The man was simply too scary. Even if he was just at a barren level, Han Sen wouldn't give him the chance to escape. Ancient Devil looked at Han Senator. He smiled and said, You just want to trick me. You want me to give you the solution, and then you can abandon your end of the bargain and keep me here. I don't think you're going to get what you want. Tell me something I have never heard about first, Han Sen said, his face unchanging. Ancient Devil was quick-witted. He did not keep saying that Han Sen wouldn't provide him his freedom. He fell silent, then said, According to theory, there is only one way to break super space/. What way is that? Han Sen said quickly. He had expected Ancient Devil to continue refusing to answer, but the man had replied startlingly fast. It is to kill yourself. Ancient Devil looked serious, and Han Sen could tell that the man meant what he said. But this was an answer that confused Han Sen. Are you serious? Han Sen thought Ancient Devil was playing with him. He couldn't imagine how killing himself would solve anything. Ancient Devil gave Han Sen a predatory grin. Haven't you heard about dying and then being reborn? If you don't die, how are you supposed to dodge super space/? Han Sen had heard of rebirth before, but he didn't know what it had to do with super space/. He wanted to find a way to counter super space/ because he wanted to live. What was the point of killing himself? Ancient Devil pointed at Han Sen and said, Before, we all swore to die like it was yesterday, and after, swore to live like today. Today, you are still alive. Then, what is the difference if you were to die yesterday? As he listened to Ancient Devil, Han Sen felt like he was lost in an impenetrable fog. He had no idea what Ancient Devil was talking about, but he knew that continuing to ask wouldn't improve the situation. Unless he agreed to let Ancient Devil go, of course. Otherwise, Ancient Devil would continue to avoid reaching the crux of the matter and explaining what was required to break super space/. Although in truth, the hints that Han Sen had received thus far weren't all that bad. After leaving Destiny's Tower, Han Sen thought about what Ancient Devil had said to him. He still couldn't understand what the man was saying. Suicide. and dying yesterday, being alive today. What is ancient devil trying to tell me? Han Sen spent a long time thinking the matter over, but he couldn't quite figure it out. It felt like the concept was just beyond reach. Suddenly, an invisible shockwave rolled through the air. Two shadows emerged from a quickly gathering mist, and they landed on the plaza of the palace. Exquisite and Li Qier are finally here. Han Sen exulted, once he looked closer to confirm that it was them. Ever since he had been locked up in this bottle world, he hadn't seen hide nor hair of Li Qier or Exquisite. As both of them walked before him now, Han Sen didn't say anything. He knew Exquisite and Li Qier were only youngsters among the very high. They wouldn't be allowed to make any important decisions. Even if they wanted to free Han Sen, they didn't have the authority. The scales across your body are gone. Li Qier gasped, looking Han Sen over. Yes. I don't know why, but the scales just vanished. Can you ask the leader if I can leave now? Han Sen said. Exquisite and Li Qier looked at each other. It was as if they wanted to tell him something, but they were hesitant to actually say it. In the end, Exquisite ended up saying, the leader still wants you to stay in the bottle. Does that mean he's going to keep me bottled up in here forever? Han Sen said with a frown. Don't worry, Li Qier assured him. We will try our best to show everyone that you aren't a threat. We will try to get your freedom back as soon as possible. My body no longer possesses the scales. Doesn't that help erase any suspicions they have about me? Han Sen pointed out, but his voice didn't sound particularly hopeful. Exquisite sighed. If the scales had been removed by my people, of course, they wouldn't remain suspect. But now it seems that the scales have simply disappeared by themselves. I'm afraid the leader and the elders won't believe that the scales just vanished of their own accord and went away for good. That means I'm still to be trapped here? Han Sen's mind had become placid once again. He didn't expect the very high to let him go. He would have to escape using his own power. Li Qier tried to provide comfort by saying, we will try to help you in any way we can. You just need to hold out a little longer, okay? Han Sen wasn't a rookie who had only just started adventuring. He knew these were just words of comfort that wouldn't lead to any real changes in his situation. If I can't leave this place, can you bring me some books so that I'm not completely bored? Han Sen asked flatly. What kind of books would you like to read? In a situation like this, I don't think our people will let you read any kind of Geno art, Li Qier said, as straight as an arrow. She was often like that, telling Han Sen what he needed to know. No Geno arts. I just want some books about philosophy and theology. Something about life and death would be best. Han Sen was hoping that these books might give him inspiration, perhaps revealing what ancient devil meant when he spoke of suicide. Let me find a way. We will try and get these books for you, Li Qier answered. Thanks a lot. Han Sen smiled. You're our silkworm. This is what we should be doing. Li Qier trailed off halfway and fell silent. Han Sen's situation now was different. He wasn't really their silkworm anymore. But Han Sen seemed to be doing better than they had expected. The way he casually spoke with them, he didn't sound as if he was going to be locked up forever. Before they left, Exquisite told Han Sen, I will tell the leader that the scales have disappeared. They will most likely send someone to examine your condition. But I don't think there is a high chance of you leaving. So, do not put too much hope in getting out soon. I understand, Han Sen said with a nod. He knew Exquisite had no authority in this matter, so the final say-so wasn't her decision to make. Not long after they left, a very high true god elite appeared before Han's senator. He checked Han Sen out and asked Han Sen some questions. Han Sen had already composed his answers a long time ago, so when he was asked what had happened, he had a story ready to go. The explanation wasn't entirely perfect because Han Sen kept trying to avoid talking about certain things. The very high elder couldn't tell what was going on. After the very high elder left, no one came to see him for a few days. Han Sen spent the entire time practicing the sit and forget sutra. Time passed rather easily. It has been a while since I saw Yanran and Linger. I wonder if Linger has grown up yet. And I wonder what is going on with Little Flower. Mom and Dad said they wanted to spend some time traveling. I wonder if they have come back yet. Sometimes, Han Sen would get distracted as he thought about how much he missed his family. The Sit and Forget Sutra is completely different from Under the Sky. One of them is about entering the world, and the other is about exiting the world. Combining them will be hard, and I have never practiced very high sense before, so I have to use Under the Sky as a base. If I start from the beginning with my practice, I don't know how long it will take for me to learn the Sit and Forget Sutra. Han Sen had no way of accurately predicting when he would elevate the new skill to a usable level. The Sit and Forget Sutra and Under the Sky were similar in structure, but according to the theory, they operated on different wavelengths. They were practically polar opposites. Even though he had managed to obtain the Alpha's experience in mind, he couldn't combine the two techniques. While Han Sen was stewing in his own frustration, a shadow appeared through the mist surrounding the palace. It was an old, very high man Han Sen wasn't familiar with. The old man didn't speak. He only tossed something at Han Sen, then turned around and left. Han Sen raised an eyebrow, having no clue what the old man had just done. He picked up the item and looked it over. It was a mini laptop, about the size of a person's hand. Han Sen turned on the computer. He couldn't connect to the internet, but there were many e-books inside it. Now Han Sen understood. This was probably Li Qier and Exquisite's delivery. Han Sen browsed quickly through the titles, and he realized that e-books really were the only things that the computer contained. Most of the books were about philosophy and theology. There wasn't anything about GenoArts at all. Han Sen hadn't really expected to find a GenoArt anyway. He flicked through the books. With how much his brain had evolved, it was an easy task for him to memorize the exact contents of a book with 1,000,000 words. He could recall the content perfectly without forgetting a single word. Understanding it, however, was something else entirely. Flush Reel Sutra. Han Sen jerked when he saw the title of one of the books. Han Sen had seen the Flush Reel Sutra before, but that time, the GenoArt had been written on a tablet. Han Sen hadn't understood it. To be more accurate, the GenoArt had been transcribed across many tablets, and Han Sen had only seen one part of it. According to legend, the Buddha had gained so much strength in recent times because they were researching the broken Flush Reel Sutra. That was how they had risen to such prominence in the universe. Many Buddha GenoArts had been developed from the Flush Reel Sutra. Even the shape-shifting skill that Burning Lamp Alpha once used to turn Han Sen into an ant had originated in the Flush Reel Sutra. This book must just happen to have the same name. This isn't the actual GenoArt, is it? Han Sen opened it to take a look. He scanned through the text, but it didn't seem to be a GenoArt. It was just a treatise involving concepts of theology and science. It was just like an ordinary theology book. The Flush Reel Sutra had so many vague and deep passages, it was difficult to even determine a correct interpretation of the GenoArt's contents. But Han Sen had a head start in understanding it. After all, he had once put a great deal of effort into studying the Dongxian Sutra. Now, that hard work was paying dividends. Han Sen continued paging through the book, searching for something noteworthy. Nothing important jumped out at him, and the more he read, the less interested he became. After a while, the content became so boring that Han Sen was about to move on to a different manuscript. At that moment, Han Sen found an article that triggered his interest. It talked about there being more than one universe in existence. It was trying to say that the universe didn't exist alone. It was actually a part of a fabric containing many different universes. It was possible for creatures to travel between these universes. The concept was difficult to understand. It was like Han Sen was standing on a train, and the universe he inhabited was the carriage around him. However, if he walked forward into a different carriage, he would be in another universe. People weren't locked into the universes that they were born in. Throughout their lives, they flowed seamlessly from one universe into another, and most of the time, they didn't even realize that anything had changed. The divisions between universes weren't as obvious as a train that was partitioned into carriages. Universes were separated from each other by rules of time and space. The space you were in during one particular second would be different from the space you occupied in the next second. Based on this multiverse theory, it was logical that a person could go back in time or forward into the future. If there was only one universe, then a person would be locked into a single moment in time, and the past and future would remain forever out of reach. But if reality actually existed as a multiverse, then time could be altered. If a parallel universe existed in the past or the future, then it would be possible to go there. Of course, The Flush Reel Sutra didn't give any clear instructions on how Han Sen could go forward and backward in the multiverse. But the theory did provide Han Sen with some inspiration. According to the theory, Super Space Slash's power could slash through one universe and reach the next. So, even though Han Sen could see a knife light, he couldn't block the knife light. Therefore, he couldn't dodge it. That was because the attack was actually landing in a previous universe, and Han Sen was only being injured as a sort of after effect. If I use my body to block God's knife's power in the last universe, then I won't get hurt in the present. Like when I use Super God's spirit body. No matter what time or universe I might be in, God's knife's power cannot hurt me. But the problem is, the Super God's spirit body is limited right now. Even if I could use it, I'd just end up in a stalemate with God's knife unless I could find some way to destroy it. When my time with Super God's spirit body expired, the fight would be over. I'd lose. Han Sen continued talking to himself. It isn't like there is no other way. My body cannot withstand God's knife, but Super Space Slash's power doesn't seem to be complete. It cannot choose which universe it slashes into. He can only slash the universe 1 second before. If I could only predict the creature's attacks a second before they land, I could block. But God's knife continues to grow, and its attacks might no longer be limited to a second before. It would be immensely difficult to predict where an attack was coming from, and if God's knife continues to develop, it will become even more difficult. Plus, God's knife can see where I've moved in the following second. No matter what my defense is, the beast can choose to avoid my defensive position and target whichever weak point of mine it wishes to attack. If I can learn the Sit and Forget Sutra, I can cut off my connection to the past. Even if the me in the last universe was killed, then the me in the present wouldn't be affected. That would be the best-case scenario. But the Sit and Forget Sutra and Under the Sky are in conflict. They cannot be practiced together. So, if I want to block Super Space Slash, I have to predict the attack's direction a second before it is unleashed. Maybe I can use the Shield of the Medusa's Gaze to block the attack? That would be difficult, but it isn't as if I cannot do it. Judgment and formation talents are what I am best at. After all, Under the Sky is the top Geno art for those who excel in those skills. Maybe I can really predict 1 second before, but now, the biggest problem is how to allow God's knife to see my movement and still keep it from hitting a vulnerable point. The Sit and Forget Sutra couldn't be combined with Under the Sky, and he couldn't understand what Ancient Devil was talking about. Instead of worrying about both problems at once, Han Sen focused on practicing Under the Sky to see if he could predict the actions of someone 1 second in advance. God's knife could predict what would happen 1 second in the future, and so Han Sen had to learn the future that God's knife already knew. Somehow, he had to force his opponent to attack his shield, rather than his vulnerable flesh. It was an incredibly difficult challenge. Ordinary people couldn't fathom doing such a thing. But Han Sen didn't believe it was an impossible task. Super Space Slash was only one skill. It must be breakable. The fight would be something like a game of chess. Every time Han Sen moved, it would alter his opponent's response. Checkmate was achieved by pushing his opponent into a place where none of his options were good ones. But that thought led to another difficulty. In chess, a player had to attack their opponent's weakness. In order to limit his opponent's options, Han Sen would need to threaten him. If the threat level wasn't high enough, God's knife could just ignore Han Sen's provocation. God's knife is so durable. Even old Blood Dragon Lady couldn't destroy his body. I don't have a strong enough weapon, and my personal power hasn't reached such a godly level. But even if I can't kill God's knife, if I can just rattle it, I might stand a chance. Han Sen was so excited thinking about this. He finally had an idea. Han Sen's strongest skill was Super Spank. In addition, he had Break 6 Skies and Heart Connection. The levels and powers of each skill were different. Super Spank wasn't powerful enough to shatter the substance chains of God's knife. So, right now, it wasn't useful. Heart Connection's penetration power was strong, but against God's knife's strong body, it would be useless. The explosive power of Break 6 Skies, however, was perfect for Han Sen's situation. In the days that followed, Han Sen didn't eat or drink much. He spent all his time modifying Under the Sky and Break 6 Skies. Under the Sky wasn't very compatible with Break 6 Skies, so Han Sen would have to use his dual pistols from spell to channel the power. And Break 6 guys had to be modified, as well. He might not be using the Geno Art's full destructive capability, but the explosive power had to be sufficient to annihilate God's knife. Only by doing that could Han Sen perform his 1-second judgment into the past. This was a very big project. Han Sen focused all his attention on modifying the skills. He wanted to make the technique as perfect as possible. God's knife was such a scary being. If there was the slightest flaw in his plan, Han Sen would lose the fight and die. But Han Sen was confident that he had what it took. Sooner or later, he'd make it work. Now that I have sorted out how to deal with the super space slash problem, I must move on to the last problem that is standing in my way. How can I actually destroy God's knife? While Han Sen was practicing, he mulled over this next task. If he was unable to destroy God's knife, blocking super space slash was pointless. Reaching a stalemate would be the same as losing. Gu Wanner would remain trapped either way. But with Han Sen's current resources and power, he couldn't defeat God's knife. If I can't break it, then I must find a way to trap it. Maybe Turtle would be a good choice for that, but I just don't know if it will work on God's knife. Han Sen realized that his imagination alone wouldn't be enough to solve the problem. Whether he was attempting to predict his opponent's attack vector or trying to determine the effectiveness of Turtle, he needed to perform real-world tests. He had to see how his plans worked out in proper combat. It looks like I still need to go to God's farm. I wonder if God's knife is still on the Demon Sheep planet. Once Han Sen finished modifying Under the Sky and Break 6 guys, he planned to go to God's farm. The path other people walk is the path for them. I have to walk my own path. Han Sen continued not to eat and drink, and he kept chipping away at his modifications to the Geno Arts. He didn't sleep or rest for 2 weeks. Every time he thought of Gu Wanner having to use her own blood to feed that knife every day, Han Sen's heart ached. Before the modification works were finished, Exquisite came back. But this time, it was only her. Likir didn't join her. The leader still isn't willing to let me out? Han Sen asked, glancing at Likir. He was already prepared. Exquisite didn't answer Han's senator, she only coldly told him to follow her. Then, she flew toward the mist. Han Sen was surprised. This was well beyond his wildest expectations. Exquisite was going to lead him out of the bottle. Han Sen had never expected the very high to actually free him. But if he was able to leave there so easily, he wasn't going to hesitate or complain. He flew to catch up with Exquisite, and he followed her through the mist. Does the leader believe that I'm not cursed? Han Sen asked Exquisite. Don't say or ask anything. I've got this. You just need to be quiet and follow me, Exquisite said without even looking at him. Han Sen could feel there was something amiss here, but he didn't dare to speak again. He remained silent and followed after Exquisite. Exquisite guided the two of them through the mist, and they eventually emerged outside the bottle. The hall that held the bottle had such powerful restrictions that they didn't need a very high to guard the place. Exquisite had used a small stamp to enter, and it kept the restrictions from affecting her. She led Han Sen out of the hall. After exiting the hall, Exquisite placed her hand on Han Sen's shoulder. She was going to teleport both of them away from that place. But Han Sen took her hand, stopping her from using Galaxy Teleport. Exquisite looked at Han Sen with confusion, and Han Sen looked back at her with a very serious expression. In a quiet voice, he said, "Answer my question. Are you taking me to the leader?" Exquisite hesitated a bit, but then she shook her head and said, "No." With that answer, Han Sen was almost certain that his guess was correct. He persisted and asked Exquisite, "The leader hasn't given you permission to take me out of the bottle world, has he? You don't need to concern yourself with such matters. I'm taking you away from Outer Sky. After you leave Outer Sky, you should go back to Sky Palace. Tell everything that happened here to Zhang Xiandao. If he is willing to keep you, I don't think our leader will try to take you back from Sky Palace," Exquisite said. Han Sen's expression became unreadable. He knew what was happening now. Exquisite was taking a huge risk. She was breaking the rules and setting him free on the sly. Han Sen had never expected that Exquisite might do something like this for him. Han Sen had only thought of Exquisite as a tool for accelerating his growth, but now he couldn't consider her that way anymore. Why? Han Sen asked, giving Exquisite a complex look. You came into this place alive. I'm going to make sure you leave this place the same way, Exquisite said with an emotionless look. If I leave, what is going to happen to you? Han Sen knew the Very High's rules were strict. The Very High could be an extremely heartless people. If someone broke the rules, they wouldn't look on the transgression kindly. Nothing much will happen. All I have done is set my silkworm free. It isn't a big deal. And I have other things to do anyway. Stop wasting my time, Exquisite said coldly. Han Sen nodded and said, yes. We really can't waste any time. Take me back to the bottle world. Exquisite froze. Then, she looked at Han Sen with confusion and asked, you don't want to leave? That is correct. If you had destroyed your contract with me and trapped me in the bottle world and scolded me, someday I would put my knife to your neck and leave this place by force. Han Sen paused, and then he went on to say, but if you let me go like this, I will feel very guilty. I cannot owe someone this much. Han Sen hadn't been with the Very High for very long, but he had taken the time to read their cruel rules. He knew what would happen if she let him go. She might not be killed, but she would be imprisoned for a century. Han Sen's personality wouldn't allow that to happen. He didn't mind fighting people. No matter how cruel the enemy was, he could find a way to kill them. But he was afraid of people treating him too kindly. He didn't want to owe anyone too much. Han Sen didn't know how he could pay back a woman who had wasted her youth on him. He didn't want Exquisite to be in jail on his behalf for 100 years. So, he had no choice but to stay. Of course, Han Sen also had a plan. His situation wasn't hopeless. If it had been hopeless, he would have simply left and taken Exquisite with him. But he couldn't do that just yet, because Exquisite might not completely betray the Very High to be with him. So, Han Sen had to reject Exquisite's good intentions. You won't owe me anything. This isn't a big deal, Exquisite said to Han Sen casually. How can a century of jail time be considered nothing? How many centuries can you even live for? Han Sen asked. How did you know that? Exquisite was shocked. Send me back. Han Sen didn't answer. He calmly looked at Exquisite with soft eyes. You need to know that if you miss this chance, you risk being trapped inside the bottle's world forever. Exquisite looked at Han Sen with a conflicted expression. No, I will not. I will use my powers to leave. Nothing can trap me there, Han Sen said firmly. His face looked so confident, as if he was telling her that 1 + 1 is equal to 2. Exquisite looked at Han Sen with a complicated expression. Her resolve had been firm when she decided to go against the rules and risk releasing Han Senator. She might not be jailed for 100 years, but she could still receive extremely dire punishments. But now Han Sen wasn't willing to leave, and he said he would use his powers to escape. Exquisite didn't know why Han Sen was so confident about this. To her, the things he said were mad. The bottle world was inside the hall of the Very High's Alpha. The restrictions there were extremely powerful. In all likelihood, not even a true god elite could access such a place without the Very High stamp that disarmed the restrictions. Han Sen was a man who had just become deified, and he was proudly announcing that he could use his own power to escape the Alpha's hall. But his certainty aside, he was still locked inside the bottle world. Anyone would think Han Sen was crazy for claiming to be capable of such a thing. You need to think about this. My offer now is your only chance, Exquisite said, looking intently at Han Sen. Send me back. It will look bad if people find us here like this, Han Sen said calmly. Exquisite could feel what Han Sen was thinking, and she felt rather touched by it. He didn't want her to get dragged into so much trouble on his behalf. That was why he was so determined to return to the bottle. But Exquisite still didn't understand where Han Sen was getting his confidence. It was outlandish to think he could escape a true god prison of his own volition. Suddenly, Exquisite's face went blank. She sighed and said, now it is too late for you to go. After that, she stopped hesitating. She took Han Sen back to the Alpha's hall and returned him to the bottle world. When Exquisite returned into the bottle with Han Sen, she found Uncle Nine waiting for her inside. He looked at Exquisite and frowned. Exquisite, come with me. Han Sen knew Uncle Nine must have found out that she had taken him away for a brief spell. It was fortunate that he didn't actually leave. Otherwise, the Very High would have considered Exquisite to be a criminal. Exquisite looked at Han Sen with a complex expression. Then, she followed Uncle Nine to leave the bottle world. It looks like the Very High haven't found out that the blood coral has escaped their seal and come back to me. It's amazing that even their elders didn't notice it was gone. Han Sen was very curious about the blood coral, but although it seemed to be quite resilient, he couldn't use it as a weapon. It was just a vessel for old blood dragon lady's body. Han Sen continued to modify his Under the Sky and Break 6 skies until he couldn't think of any way to take them further. Then he found the time to go to God's farm again. Han Sen carefully entered God's farm, but he didn't see Gu Wanner or God's knife anywhere. The carriage that was pulled by 9 unicorns had also vanished. Gu Wanner should come back, right? Han Sen was no longer worried about his safety. He was worried about what had happened last time. The knife or its master might have decided to stop Wanner from coming to Demon Sheep Planet now. What is God's farm, exactly? Is it a xenogenic space, or is it part of the normal universe? Han Sen realized he hadn't tried going back to the sanctuary from there. He knew the chances of it working were slim, but he didn't mind trying. But when he tested it, he really was transported back home. Even Han Sen was surprised, and he said, "If I can travel back here, that means God's farm is somewhere in the universe. It isn't a separate dimension like outer sky. If that is the case, then I will be free if I can escape the Demon Sheep Planet's restrictions." If Han Sen's only problem was being trapped inside the bottle world, this would have made him extremely happy. But now, even though he was free, he couldn't be happy because he had no way of saving Wanner. Should I tell Lone Bamboo about Wanner? But I don't know where to find God's farm unless I travel to it using the 4-sheep cube. It is pointless to tell Lone Bamboo this. I need to figure it all out for myself first. Han Sen went back home. He saw his baby daughter Linger and felt much more relaxed. "My dear Linger, when Dad was not around, were you being naughty?" He held Linger in his arms. He kissed her on the cheek and smiled. Linger did behave. "Daddy didn't behave," Linger said with a blink. "Since when have I been a naughty boy?" Han Sen asked curiously. Linger looked at Ji Yinran, who was cooking in the kitchen. She quietly told Han Sen, "Daddy hasn't been back for a long time. It has made Mommy very angry." "How angry is she?" Han Sen quietly asked Linger. Linger held onto Han Sen's neck, placed her little mouth next to Han Sen's ear, and whispered in a voice that only the two of them would hear. "Mommy said she would teach you a lesson when you came back." Han Sen stayed at home for a few days. Every now and again, he would return to God's farm. He still hadn't seen Wanner or God's knife, and he didn't have any idea when they would return to the planet. "I can't just keep waiting like this. I guess it's time to see if I can break the defenses of Demon Sheep Planet." Han Sen looked up into the skies above him. He became a xenogeniac and flew up off the surface. Just like last time, as Han Sen was about to breach the atmosphere, countless knife lights manifested around him. Each attack dealt damage that was equivalent to the strike of a primitive deified elite. The sea of knife lights seemed endless. Han Sen could have ignored 1 or 2 of those knife lights, but he couldn't deal with them in the tens or hundreds. There were just too many of those knife lights. They swept toward him like a river, coming down on him without reprieve. Han Sen used his Medusa shield to fight back, and although the shield didn't break, the scary impacts knocked Han Sen down from the sky. He shot to the surface like a meteor, creating a huge impact crater when he hit the ground. Han Sen made several attempts to get past the planet's defenses, but he realized he couldn't escape the planet using brute force. Even larva-class deifieds wouldn't be able to break through the defensive net. If my super god spirit body wasn't being affected by Wanner, I could escape. I haven't been able to use super god spirit body for the longest time, though. It only stays active for a few seconds, and I don't know if that would be enough time for me to escape. Now that he had exhausted his other options, Han Sen knew he'd have to give it a try. He lifted his shield and flew into the sky once more. When his body could no longer take the impact of the knife lights, he lowered the Medusa shield and activated his super god spirit mode. While he was in his invincible mode, Han Sen teleported. This attempt worked out much better than Han Sen had expected. His heart began to beat more quickly. He needed to teleport as far as he could in order to escape the planet's defenses. But when he teleported again, he lost track of how far he had traveled. When he emerged from the jump, he found himself in a strange part of the cosmos. After a while, he noticed located demon sheep planet behind him. It was so distant that it appeared to be the size of his fist. It looked like little more than a small moon from here. His super god spirit mode came to an end. It had only lasted long enough for him to teleport once. As Han Sen looked around, he saw a group of people flying past. He looked closer, and he noticed a particular destroyed amongst them. It was Bar. Dollar, why are you here? Bar noticed Han Sen and recognized his Dongshin armor. If I said I was lost, would you believe me? Han Sen asked. Bar raised his eyebrows at the answer. He gave Han Sen a weird look and said, "You are lost out here? What is this place?" Han Sen asked. "We're in an underdeveloped, barren area. It isn't far from a large barren system. As for precisely where we are, I can't really tell you. After all, this place is mostly unexplored." "There are no maps here," Bar said. Han Sen was shocked. He thought to himself, "A big barren system? That means it most likely belonged to sacred in ancient times. It is an entrance to the sanctuaries. This was the place that Old Cat brought Little Flower. What are you doing in such a dangerous place?" Han Sen asked Bar. "This place isn't a large barren system, so it isn't too dangerous. It is just a poor system with few resources, but a small race here discovered a xenogenic space. They claim they found something awesome here. That is why I have come out here to look." Bar looked at Han Sen and said, "Are you interested in visiting this xenogenic space to check?" Han Sen didn't answer. The few deified elites that were accompanying Bar approached him. One of them smiled and said, "Bar, why don't you introduce us to this friend of yours? This is the human called Dollar. He was the Marquis winner of the last Geno being scroll," Bar explained to the deified, his voice carrying a modicum of respect. He was quite polite to this other destroyed. After that, Bar pointed at the deified elite and said, "Dollar, this is the destroyed's transmutation deified. He is Elder Nader." Bar didn't introduce the other people around Elder Nader. He only said they were students of Elder Nader. They were all just kings or half-deifieds. Bar himself was already deified, and he couldn't be bothered to introduce them all. Elder Nader could see that Bar was being very friendly to Han Senator. He thought Han Sen had to be an elite from some big race, but he was just some scion of a smaller race. The man swiftly lost interest, and he only addressed the occasional casual remark toward Han Sen. Dollar had reached first place in the Marquis Geno being scroll, but Marquises were very different from deifieds. Nader thought he had no reason to take a deified that came from a small race seriously. Although it was difficult to become deified, the smaller races occasionally got lucky. They might stumble upon a treasure or get their hands on a resource from a stronger race and become deified. But deifieds like that always had a bad base. They lacked knowledge and practical skills, and they were likely to cause trouble. The destroyed had previously adopted a few deifieds like that, but showing such benevolence had never worked out well for the destroyed. The deifieds did little to benefit the destroyed, and instead, they were a frequent pain in the *SS for their host race. Ever since then, the destroyed had stopped recruiting deifieds from smaller races. They would rather raise their own elites. If Han Sen had been from a big race, Elder Nader would have liked to talk to him. But after learning who Dollar was, he was no longer interested. Elder Nader might not take Han Sen seriously, but Bar knew about Dollar through Jia Robber. Even Jia Robber really admired the elusive Dollar, so Bar would never think about underestimating him. "Brother Dollar, if there is nothing else for you to do here, how about you come with us to explore that xenogenic space?" Bar said, inviting Han Sen along again. "We can explore together, but if we get something good, how will we split it?" Han Sen wasn't really interested in a xenogenic space, but he didn't know much about this system. Following Bar and the others might save him from some trouble in the future. Elder Nader is a transmutation deified. He has the most power here. He will take 60% of the goods. "How about we split the other 40% between you and me?" Bar suggested after a moment of silence. Elder Nader wasn't very happy about that proposition. In his eyes, Dollar was just a primitive deified. 20% was too much, he believed. Dollar shouldn't receive any more than 10%. But since Bar had already made the offer, Elder Nader wasn't going to embarrass the man by stepping on his toes. He remained quiet. Han Sen shook his head. That isn't very fair. Never mind. Brother Dollar, how would you suggest we split it? You can tell us. Bar knew this adventure would be dangerous. Having an elite like Dollar would benefit their mission quite a bit. I'm always very fair. If this is a cooperation, I think we should split the rewards 50-50ths. The destroyed get 50, and the humans get 50, Han Sen said seriously. Fury swept through Elder Nader and his students, and they wanted to burst out crying and laughing at the same time. He had already been a little upset about the prospect of Han Sen receiving 20%, but he knew that discovering a new xenogenic space could be a dangerous and weird adventure. Enlisting the help of an extra deified was a good idea. He wouldn't have agreed to the 20% offer if he hadn't understood that having Han Sen along could prove useful. But now, Han Sen wanted 50% of the total goods. That was too ridiculous. Small races have their diminutive status for a reason. After becoming deified, they do tend to become full of themselves. I'm afraid he doesn't even know the difference between a primitive deified and a transmutation deified. And he wants to split the goods 50-50ths? Elder Nader was angered by the suggestion. He looked at Han Sen and snorted. If you were a larva deified, I would consider 50-50ths. I am primitive. I will only accept 50-50. Han Sen stood his ground. Even though he was only primitive, his body was incredibly strong, and he had studied many geno-arts. Even ordinary transmutation deifieds couldn't really defeat Han Sen or so. Han Sen believed 50-50 was fair, but Elder Nader was not of the same opinion. After hearing Han Sen, he laughed. Your stomach is too big. We can't feed you. In that case, I have to go, Han Sen said. Then, he turned to Bar and told him, Brother Bar, do you have a star map I can purchase? I would really appreciate it if you could sell one to me. It is just a star map. It isn't worth much. Just take it, if you need it. Bar opened his communicator and sent the star map to Han Sen. Thanks a lot. We will meet again, Brother Bar. Han Sen accepted it and nodded his thanks. Seeing Han Sen leave, one of Elder Nader's students laughed. He really doesn't know his place. He thinks that becoming deified has made him invincible in the universe. A deified like him, who doesn't know his place, is as insubstantial as smoke. There is nothing for him to be cocky about. Yeah, he is just a primitive deified. Our master could squeeze him to death with one hand. Why be so polite to him? I am afraid he doesn't understand how much difference there is between a primitive and a transmutation. That is why he was so confident. Master, you should take this into your own hands and show him who the boss is. Who gave him the confidence to suggest going 50-50 with the master? The students kept talking and judging Han Senator. They sounded as if they were all stronger than Han Senator. They had clearly forgotten that they were all kings and Han Sen was deified. Han Sen kept flying. As he went, he examined his star map. A quick perusal of the star map confirmed that the system he was currently in was near a big barren system. It is a shame they aren't exploring the big barren system. Otherwise, I would have gone with them for free, Han Sen said to himself. But not long after, he encountered someone he was familiar with once again. He saw Dragon One flying quickly toward him. Dollar! Dragon One screamed in shock. Upon seeing Dollar, the man had recognized him immediately. Han Sen had no choice but to talk to Dragon One. Dragon One was headed toward the xenogenic space, but something must have happened to the dragon race, because he was going alone. Brother Dollar, are you interested in exploring a xenogenic space with me? Dragon One thought the same thing as Bar. People like Han Sen were good to have as allies when you were going someplace dangerous. We can go together, but if we do, we must split the rewards 50-50, Han Sen said immediately, not wanting to waste time beating around the bush. Dragon One didn't hesitate. He smiled. Of course. Once Dragon One had agreed to Han Sen's request, he explained the situation inside the xenogenic space. Because it was near the Big Barren system, and it was largely unexplored, not many of the high races went there. So, this place had been taken over by a lower race known as the Red Rats. The Red Rats were a small race, and the strongest of them were only king class. They didn't even have a half-deified in their midst. There weren't many xenogenics in that system, so they had always been fine. But in more recent times, a star had exploded in the system. The explosion had turned out to have important ramifications for the red rats. After the star exploded, the red rats discovered, to their shock, that the star had hidden the entrance to a xenogenic space. The red rats were happy about this, and so they sent people to explore the xenogenic space. But then, something happened. 100 million red rats had gone to explore that xenogenic space, but only one red rat made it back. The other red rats perished someplace inside. According to the red rat that survived, the xenogenic space was a very spooky place. It was like there were countless suns hanging in there. The xenogenic space was very hot and scary. They tried to get close to one of the suns, but the sun suddenly exploded. Millions of the red rats were turned into dust. Only that one red rat made it back, but it didn't even know why it had been spared. By all logic, it should have died in the explosion like the other red rats. The survivor was only a small viscount, too. It wasn't any stronger than the 100 million red rats that had died. Since no marquises had survived, it was hard to imagine how he managed to make it out. And then, a few days later, that lucky red rat evolved. It went from viscount to earl, and then it continued leveling up. This sudden evolution was shocking for everyone. When Dragon 1 arrived, the creature had just become king class. The situation was so weird, and the strange red rat had garnered the attention of every race. They wanted to figure out what spurred the creature's swift evolution. They wondered what sort of benefit the red rat had managed to get his hands on inside the xenogenic space. He had been evolving at an unbelievable rate. Many races had sent their low-level people into the xenogenic space, but none of those teams had been heard from again. So, all the races were now forced to send their deified elites to check the place out. After hearing Dragon 1 explain all this, Han Sen's curiosity was piqued. He also wanted to know why the red rat had evolved so quickly. Its evolution speed was something of a miracle in the Geno universe. Han Sen and Dragon 1 raced to the entrance of that xenogenic space. On the way, Dragon 1 had been thinking quite a bit. He glanced at Han Sen, who seemed content to travel silently beside him. He couldn't help but cough and say, "Brother Dollar, aren't you interested in how I leveled up to deified so quickly? Is becoming deified something special?" Han Sen looked at Dragon 1 with confusion. Dragon 1 didn't know what to say. The speed with which he had become deified made him one of the best of the dragons. Han Sen had made it sound like something average and expected. That depressed him a little. He had intended to show off and maybe brag a little, but he couldn't do that now. After they reached their destination, Han Sen couldn't keep the surprise off his face. The entrance to the xenogenic space was a black hole. It must have become a black hole after the sun exploded. Once the destructive power was expended, it had collapsed into the entrance to a xenogenic space. The two of them had gone there to explore, so they weren't going to be put off or frightened by the intimidating sight. They both entered the black hole. As soon as they did, Han Sen felt as if he had been teleported through space. What was inside the xenogenic space caught Han Sen off guard. Dragon 1 had said that the place was filled with suns, so he had thought the xenogenic space was in space. After getting there, he realized it was a large landmass. The land stretched into the distance, seemingly without end. There were mountains, boulders, and trees everywhere that Han Sen looked. But it was different from ordinary lands. The mountains, boulders, and woods all looked like charcoal. It was like this whole world had turned into ash. Everything in sight was painted in shades of black and white. The scene wasn't colorful like a normal landscape should have been. All of the surrounding land and mountains were a monochromatic pitch black. Some of them even had burned, charcoal-like crystals. The air was frighteningly hot. It felt like the whole place might catch fire any second. Han Sen raised his head to the sky, and there he saw what Dragon 1 had told him about. Several enormous suns hung in the sky. There had to be at least a dozen of them. What do these suns do? Are they planets? Or are they some sort of creature? Han Sen wondered aloud. He stared at the suns in the sky as he spoke. He was so far away that he couldn't feel the presence of the suns. He could only feel the scary heat that was coming from them. "I don't know. What I do know for sure, though, is that these suns must not have always been here," Dragon 1 said. "Why do you say that?" Han Sen looked at Dragon 1 with confusion. Dragon 1 pointed at a nearby mountain that was black and crystalline. It was all burned, and he said, "Look over there. There is a building next to that mountain. That means there used to be life there." Han Sen looked to where Dragon One was pointing. He saw that, in the middle of the burned mountain, there was a tower. It seemed to have 7 floors. But just like the mountains, boulders, and trees around it, the tower was as black as charcoal. It could have easily been mistaken for a lump of coal. The two of them flew toward the tower, and when they reached it, they found many other charcoal buildings as well. They stumbled across an old, charcoal city. Although they saw no creatures, judging from the size of the city, there must have been at least 100,000 creatures living there at one point. But for some reason, the old city was just like the landscape around it. It had become charcoal in the course of a single second. Everything stood perfectly still, retaining the shape it might have once had before it was blackened. Even the leaves still had their veins. This place, I think I have seen it someplace before. Wait, this place is like the place in the sanctuary where I found the little red bird. Is this the Phoenix Nirvana? Han Sen was shocked as he came to this conclusion. This place looked like the area in which Han Sen had first found the little red bird. Even the mountains and stones were charcoal. The little red bird was born in a place just like this, if you remove the additional suns from the equation. This is an impressive use of the fire element. It turned this whole place into charcoal. That isn't something ordinary heat can do, Dragon One said in awe. Han Sen raised his head and looked into the sun high above. He thought the suns were the most suspicious aspect of this realm. Perhaps they weren't even suns at all. They might have been some scary, fire element xenogenics for all he knew. According to the Red Rat survivor, one of the suns exploded and turned them all to dust. So, it is certainly possible that they're living beings. Han Sen considered the possibility, but he didn't dare to try teleporting closer to the suns to check. He was there to claim easy rewards, not to needlessly risk his life. Even if the suns were some sort of powerful xenogenic, there was no need for Han Sen to risk his own safety. Dragon One tilted his nose into the wind and sniffed, then smiled. It looks like many other creatures have already been here before we arrived. You're a dragon, not a dog, Han Sen thought. How can you take a whiff of the air and discern how many people were here before us? Dragon One was oblivious to Han Sen's skepticism, though. He went on to say, the destroyed have been here. The foxes have been here, as well. Dragon One named a dozen different races. Han Sen was shocked. He didn't know about most of the races Dragon One mentioned, but Bar and Eldernator had been there. So Dragon One was correct about the presence of the destroyed. Your nose sure is powerful, Han Sen complimented. Dragon One smiled. That is nothing remarkable. It is just a small trick of mine. I can analyze the substances that creatures and people leave behind, and it lets me learn who they were. That is so powerful, Han Sen said, with honest admiration in his voice. His Dongxian aura was similar to this, but this was more straightforward. As the pair were talking, a shadow appeared. It was heading for the old charcoal city. Han Sen and Dragon One looked warily at the shadow. In a place like this, they needed to be cautious until they were certain of who was approaching them. It could very well have been an enemy. They couldn't let their vigilance slip for one moment. It's Balian of the Extreme King, Han Sen thought. He looked at the shadow with shock. He hadn't expected to meet Balian there. But when he had seen Balian before, he was Han Senator Balian had never met Dollar before. So Han Sen stayed silent and didn't say anything. This is a deified from the Extreme King. His name is Balian, Dragon One said with a frown. While they were talking, Balian landed at a place that wasn't too far from them. He observed the two of them, and then he looked at Dragon One and said, "Ah, it is Mr. Dragon One. I didn't expect to see you here. Since we've encountered each other under such unlikely circumstances, I can only consider it as fate. Are you willing to explore this xenogenic space with me?" Balian was surprisingly polite. He didn't act like the average Extreme King elite. Han Sen was surprised. The dragons were brave people, but compared to the Extreme King, they weren't as talented. And the dragons sort of relied on the power and infrastructure of the Extreme King. In a way, the Extreme King were their employers or landlords. There was no need for Balian to behave so politely. Han Sen had no idea that while King Bai was in charge, the Bao family had been doing poorly. They were doing anything that they could to gain an edge. This time, They had sent Balian to explore the new xenogenic space. Balian must have known it was a dangerous endeavor. Cooperating with powerful elites like Dragon One would be safer than exploring alone. I would like to. Dragon One looked at Han Sen and smiled with his answer. Dragon One was worried that this place might be too dangerous, just as Bao Lian thought it might be. Since they shared a like mind, an alliance seemed to make sense. Who is this? Bao Lian asked, indicating Han Sen. Dragon One introduced Han Sen as Dollar. Bao Lian stared at Han Sen in amazement, and he said, "Is this the Dollar who came first place in the Geno being scroll battles? I heard your name a long time ago. It is a shame it has taken me so long to finally meet you. You really are a talented young man." Although the Extreme King hadn't had any of their people participate in the Geno being scroll fights, Bao Lian had made sure to watch the battles unfold. He recognized Dollar, but he wasn't really as starstruck as he was pretending to be. He only knew there was a guy called Dollar who was supposedly pretty good. "Mr. Bao Lian, you are more knowledgeable than I am. Can you tell me which civilization might have once occupied a city such as this?" Dragon One asked Bao Lian after their greetings were over. Bao Lian glanced at the buildings all around them. These structures are fairly primitive. Races usually create buildings like this when they are in their infancy. Because this culture was obviously new and underdeveloped, it is difficult to determine which race might have actually owned these. After pausing briefly, Bao Lian pointed at a tower in the old city. On this tower's wall, you can see the traces of a carving. It looks like a carving of a phoenix. And this place seems to have been barbecued by something possessing a frightening amount of power with the fire element. A deified phoenix, perhaps? Dragon One asked in wonder. He quickly looked where Bao Lian was pointing, and he noticed there was indeed a carving there, albeit a slightly blurred one. Very faintly, he could make out the shape of a bird. But Dragon One had never seen one of the legendary, true god phoenixes before. He didn't know if that was what a phoenix actually looked like. Bao Lian nodded and said, "Phoenixes are the alphas of the fire element. It is very rare that a true god phoenix arises, and if one does, even the Extreme King will not dare offend it. If this place really is connected with a phoenix, we are going to have to be careful. We cannot risk provoking it." Dragon One nodded his agreement, then turned the conversation to how they should proceed. Once they decided on a route to follow, they moved past the city and ventured deeper into the xenogenic space. Han Sen pretended to not know who Bao Lian was, and Bao Lian seemed interested enough to meet Han Senator. They talked quite a bit, and Bao Lian seemed to like him. Bao Lian continued to behave humbly, and he didn't act like the typically arrogant Extreme King. But Han Sen knew Bao Lian was a very powerful adversary. The last time they fought, Han Sen found himself in a very tricky situation, and Han Sen had yet to figure out what sort of power Bao Lian had wielded when they last fought. In truth, he was a little afraid of Bao Lian. He needed to figure out how the man's power worked. The two of them got along very well. They chatted so much along the way, it was almost as if they were brothers. "There are creatures over there," Dragon One interrupted them from up front. Han Sen and Bao Lian looked ahead and found themselves looking at two large mountains. They were 10,000 meters high, and a long stretch of wood bridged the distance between them, running from one peak to the other. In the middle of the bridge stood a big, black steel bell. Many creatures were standing along the bridge, staring at the black steel bell. The bell's base was 100 meters wide. It hung between the two mountains, and the mass and gravity of the bell made it an impressive sight to anyone within range. Mystical engravings covered the surface of the giant bell, visible even from a great distance because of the size of the bell. The engravings looked rather strange. They seemed to depict a bird that was flying through a complex series of loops and twirls. Han Sen and the others were unsure what it meant. But on the front of the bell, there was an engraving of a true god bird. There was no doubt about this picture. It represented a true god phoenix. Many creatures stood across the bridge, looking up at the black steel bell. But for some reason, none of them were fighting over it. They simply stared up at the object, enthralled. Han Sen noticed Bar and Elder Nader among the creatures standing on the bridge. They were staring up at the bell with the same expression on their faces as the creatures around them. They weren't trying to claim the item as their own, and neither were they leaving. They were transfixed. It was a strange thing for Han Sen to see. Dragon 1 called to Bar, but Bar paid him no heed. The destroyed's eyes remained firmly locked on the bell. Something is wrong, Dragon 1 said quietly. He looked in the direction of the black steel bell and frowned. There was no need for him to say it, though. Han Sen and Balian had already noticed that something was off. Bar and the others seemed to have been trapped by some unseen force. Why else would they be ignoring people who were calling their names? Han Sen secretly cast his Dongshin Sutra. He focused his attention on the two mountains, the wood that bridged them, and the black steel bell, hoping to discern a clue or two from them. As he stared at them, he did notice something. The bridge between the two mountains and the big steel bell had some sort of natural connection. They were subtly releasing some sort of power. It was rather weird. The big mountains, the bridge, the big steel bell. They were composed of 3 different materials. In ordinary circumstances, they shouldn't have been exuding the same type of power, and yet they were. The energy that radiated from them was all of the same wavelength. Weird. This is so weird, Balian mumbled as he kept looking. What have you found, Mr. Bao? Dragon 1 asked. Balian pointed at the 2 big mountains and said, Don't you think these 2 mountains look rather unique? Unique? What kind of unique are you talking about? Dragon 1 looked over the 2 mountains again and didn't seem to be anything too special about them. It's their shape. Don't you think those 2 mountains look like 2 giant apes? Balian asked in a strained voice, pointing at the 2 big mountains. Han Sen had been looking at the 2 mountains for some time, but he hadn't noticed that. Now that Balian had pointed it out, Han Sen noticed that the 2 big mountains really did look like 2 apes holding up a bridge of wood. They supported the weight of the black steel bell, which looked as if it was going to fall any second. Han Sen had many questions about what they were seeing. He was curious about the design, but he didn't come to any conclusions. Dragon 1 looked at it for a while, and before long, his eyes widened. 2 apes holding up a bridge of wood. Does that mean we're actually looking at the legendary 2-Ape Mountain? No way. 2-Ape Mountain belonged to Sacred, and it was destroyed long ago. Why is it here? This might not be the genuine 2-Ape Mountain. For all we know, it just looks similar, Balian said. But he couldn't seem to tear his eyes away from the 2-Ape Mountain. It was hard to tell what he was thinking. What is the 2-Ape Mountain? Han Sen had never heard the term before. He looked at Balian and Dragon 1. In the legends regarding Sacred, tales tell of a very famous mountain, Dragon 1 explained. Originally, 2-Ape Mountain was just a pair of ordinary mountains. They were nothing special. But later on, Sacred Leader and his trusted partner played chess for 7 days and 7 nights. Eventually, the game ended in a tie. So, the Sacred Leader decided to build a bridge between those 2 mountains and construct a pavilion at the center of the bridge to play chess. That way, he could continue playing chess with that forever trusted partner. The 2 big mountains looked like old apes, and after the bridge and the pavilion were built, it looked like the 2 old apes were carrying a carriage. Therefore, 2-Ape Mountain is occasionally called 2 apes holding up a carriage mountain. Balian carried on with the story, saying, in the legends, that pavilion was used for many chess matches between Sacred Leader and his trusted partner. It is a heavenly topic for those who love chess. But in the legends, when Sacred was destroyed, 2-Ape Mountain was also destroyed. The bridge and the pavilion went missing. What we're looking at here might appear similar, but it isn't actually 2-Ape Mountain. Dragon 1 went on to say, although moving mountains isn't difficult for deified elites, the most important part of 2-Ape Mountain was the chess records located inside the pavilion. Since the pavilion containing those records is missing, who would have gone to the effort of relocating 2-Ape Mountain all the way out here? The pavilion has been replaced with a big steel bell. I highly doubt that this is the 2-Ape Mountain that came from Sacred. Han Sen didn't really know anything about this, so he had nothing to add to the conversation. He merely listened to them explain the history. A person who could play chess with Sacred Leader? I bet Sacred's partner was very famous. What was his name, and what race did he hail from? Han Sen inquired. Dragon 1 shrugged and said, That's all I know. It is documented in the history books of our race, but I've never actually read them myself. And the books never did state who Sacred's chess partner was. Back then, Sacred Leader ruled almost the entire universe. He had many strong subordinates. He had 4 holy beasts and 10 generals. All of them were amazingly powerful elites. It would be hard to find out which of them played chess with him, Balian said. Han Sen started to ask something, but he suddenly heard a loud ringing noise. Although the air around them was still and devoid of wind, the black steel bell started to chime. Every time it moved, it unleashed a loud bell chime. The sound that the bell produced seemed entirely ordinary. There was nothing special about the acoustics. It didn't seem to possess any special kind of power. But the next second, Han Sen, Balian, and Dragon One froze. As the bell rang, the charcoal appearance of the trees and the mountains suddenly faded away. Color began to seep back into the black and white world. The charred appearance of the trees vanished, and healthy shades of green and brown swept over them. New leaves sprang into existence as Han Sen and the others watched. The vegetation around them was coming back to life with startling speed. Across the two ape-like mountains, small shrubs and grass rose around and between the rocks. What Han Sen saw was very weird. It was like a dead man coming back to life. A second later, the world around them was full of greenery. Life was spreading to cover every surface, flourishing in unchecked glory. The two mountains started to look green, as well. Everything in sight seemed to be radiating a life force. The landscape looked completely different than it had looked before. The only thing that hadn't changed was the black steel bell. It looked exactly as it had before it began to chime. The noise of the bell died down, and it remained where it was, very still. The bridge itself began to sprout branches, and Bar and the others snapped out of their daze. They all sought to fly away from the growing limbs, but as soon as they started to move, branches came at them from all directions. Bar was a primitive deified elite. With his full power, he could devastate a planet with a single punch. But he couldn't resist those branches that reached out and began to wrap themselves around him. The branches tied him up like a cocoon, with only his head poking out above the leaves. Bar wasn't the only one to be caught. Even the transmutation class Eldernator was unable to escape. He released his power in a massive surge, but under the force of the branches, his power was like snow melting under a spring sun. His attempts to protect himself dissolved into nothing, and then the branches bound him firmly. No creature upon the plank bridge was exempted from this. They were all tied up in cocoons of various sizes, and soon they were all dangling helplessly from the bridge. As Han Sen looked at them, he was struck by how much they looked like caterpillars. He had often found those insects hanging from the trees near his old house. They would hang from the branches, motionless unless a wind caught them and waved them back and forth. The sight before him was eerily similar. Han Sen kept observing the captured creatures, falling back as he did. Even Eldernator had been unable to resist the ensnaring branches. Han Sen didn't think he was much stronger than Eldernator. If he got close, he might end up suffering the same fate. He didn't want to end up snared by the branches, too. Dragon One and Balian seemed to share his opinion. They all made sure to retreat with haste. The squawking of a bird sounded clearly throughout the sky. Within a second, Han Sen felt a very frightening presence descending on the strange realm. It rushed down from the sky in a blur, moving too quickly for them to react. It was like watching a plane crash. Although the bird itself remained in the sky, the weight of the bird's aura hit the ground, instantly crushing anything on the surface. Han Sen found that his body had been slammed down into the dirt and he couldn't get up. The scary pressure was slowly pushing him into the ground like it was made of quicksand. His face had almost been crushed. He couldn't get out. Han Sen's face was on its side, trying to discern where the sound of that bird came from. Far away, up in the sky, he saw a large bird burning with a white flame. It was soaring through the air, and the very scary pressure came from its body. Han Sen couldn't be certain what kind of bird it was. It looked elegant, proud, gorgeous, majestic. It was like a god from the sky. It was like the legends that described the god phoenix. But Han Sen had never seen a real phoenix before, so he couldn't be sure if he was seeing one now. The big bird was soaring casually over the mountain. Wherever it went, the landscape beneath it came back to life. Every tree, bush, and blade of grass was brimming with life force once more. The big bird flew in slow circles, and it seemed like the whole world was following it, hoping to be given a life force again. The green trees were repopulated with leaves. Flowers were popping up out of the ground. Wherever the bird went, new life followed behind. The deserted wasteland was turning into a tropical paradise. A phoenix. It really is a phoenix. Bao Lian was lying on the ground next to Han Sen. He stared up blankly, seemingly at a loss for how to react. I've been so unlucky recently. I entered an undeveloped xenogeneic space and found a true God-class xenogeneic phoenix. The chances of that are lower than winning the lottery, Han Sen grumbled in his heart. Fortunately, the phoenix wasn't flying toward them. It flew to the plank bridging the two-ape mountain. It glided slowly forward on its huge wings until it reached the bridge. After circling the bridge 3 times, the phoenix with its white flames descended onto the wood. The fire on its body didn't harm the wood. It actually seemed to be forcing more life force into the plank, and it made the branches grow even faster. The phoenix then lowered its head to look at the creature nearest to it. The creature looked like a golem from what Han Sen could see through the cocoon of branches. Only the golem's head was clearly visible. Answer a question for me. If the answer satisfies me, then I will forgive you for offending me. The phoenix didn't physically speak, but everyone who could see the phoenix could hear its voice in their minds. I will answer any question you would like me to. What do you want to know? The golem-like creature said. One day, you and your partner encounter danger. One of you has to die for the other to be saved, and you have the power to decide. Do you choose to die for your partner to be saved? Or would you prefer that your partner perish so that you could live? The voice of the phoenix rumbled, shaking their minds as it spoke. Everyone was shocked. They had expected the deity to ask about some ancient secret. They never expected a question like this. And it didn't seem like the question had a single correct answer. Different people would respond in different ways. But since the phoenix had already asked, the golem couldn't refuse to answer. It swallowed and replied, I would sacrifice myself to save my partner so that she could live. Hypocrite. The phoenix's voice played in everyone's head. It sounded disdainful. The next second, Han Sen and the others watched the phoenix lower its head. It opened its beak in the golem's direction. But the phoenix didn't bite down. Rather, it made a sucking motion, as if it was drawing in a breath. A weird power came out of the golem's body and vanished into the phoenix's mouth. After that strange power was taken away, the golem's head looked like a dried-up husk. Then, the entire creature turned into sand and scattered across the wind. No trace of the being was left to see. Everyone stared at the place where the golem had been in silence. Although the golem was just a king-class creature, its power had been drained until it was nothing more than dust. It was a bit too scary to fully comprehend. The phoenix didn't seem to think that what it had done was a big deal. Ignoring the sand that was still leaking from the now empty cocoon, the phoenix moved to the next cocooned creature like it was walking down the aisle in a grocery store. This creature's head looked like it belonged to an octopus or squid. Han Sen recognized this one. This being had been following Elder Nader, so it had to be one of Elder Nader's students. That creature turned pale when the phoenix looked at him. And then, he heard the phoenix's voice sound again. Once more, it was in everyone's head. One day, you and your partner encounter danger. One of you has to die for the other to be saved, and you have the power to decide. Do you choose to die for your partner to be saved? Or would you prefer that your partner perish so that you could live? That creature was terrified, but it noticed that the question was exactly the same as before. He was so happy. The golem had already given one answer, and that answer was wrong. So, the squid creature assumed that the other answer must be correct. Thinking of that, the creature hastily shouted, I would choose to save myself. Obscene. Before the creature could explain why he had chosen to save himself at his partner's expense, the phoenix's angry voice rumbled in everyone's heads. The phoenix lowered its head and drew in a breath. The creature's power was ripped out of it, and the body turned into dust. The wind carried it away. A chill sank into the hearts of all the onlookers, and goosebumps flared all over their skin. They thought that giving a different answer to the question would allow them to live. But now, it seemed as if the question posed by the phoenix had no correct answer. It all depended on the phoenix's mood. Han Sen, Bao Lian, and Dragon One felt a cold sweat gather across their brows. There was nothing in the world that was scarier than an unreasonable deity. It was obvious that the god Phoenix wasn't acting rationally. You. Answer this question. The Phoenix turned to another king-class noble. That person was also a student of Elder Nader, and he was asked the same question. Master. The guy seemed to be on the verge of tears. He spoke to Elder Nader with a trembling voice. Elder Nader's face turned green. He had brought many of his students there to explore the new xenogenic space. He hadn't expected them to run face first into a true god. Such a being was a truly terrifying existence. He knew this was going to be bad. But this student was behaving with such weakness. He was a king-class elite with destroyed blood. And yet, he sounded weaker than some low-ranking outsider. Answer my question. The flames across the Phoenix's body exploded, covering the skies and the earth with a white flame. The eyes of the bird stared down at the destroyed king with demonic intensity. The destroyed student looked pale, and he hurried up to answer. I would listen to my partner. If she wanted me to live, I would live. If she wanted me to die, I would die. What a wimp. The Phoenix grunted callously. It opened its mouth and drew in a breath. Just like the other two creatures, the destroyed king's body was reduced to nothing but ash. Every person's heart sank. It was obvious that the Phoenix was playing with them. No matter what they answered, they were going to die. If you want to kill me, kill me. I'm not answering your crappy bird-brain question, shouted a nameless king when he saw the Phoenix looking down on him. If that is what you desire, then I will do it. The Phoenix was still acting very high-class and elegant. It lowered its head, opened its beak, and inhaled. The king dissolved into dust. Han Sen's heart sank. He had been hoping that the Phoenix's question was similar to the wishes offered by the gods. He had suspected that if he didn't answer the question, the Phoenix might not be able to hurt him. But after watching the death of the most recent victim, it was evident things weren't like that. Dragon One and Baolian's faces looked gray, and sweat had beaded across their faces. They thought their feelings would be reflected in Han Sen, and that they would feel hopeless. The Phoenix asked the same question to another few creatures, but no matter what they answered, the results were the same. They all had their life forces ripped out of them. The powerful Elder Nader was a transmutation deified, but he could only watch the events unfold. He couldn't resist or do anything about it. Eventually, the Phoenix came before Elder Nader. Elder Nader's 3 heads and 6 eyes stared back at the Phoenix. It looked as if he wanted to attack the Phoenix, but his body was bound too tightly by the branches. He couldn't even move, let alone fight. He couldn't even wiggle his fingers. The branches hadn't just trapped his body. If the situation was that simple, then his elite transmutation powers would have allowed him to turn a simple exhale into an end-of-the-world thunder god. He wouldn't be rendered helpless by mere physical restraints. But now, Elder Nader couldn't exert any strength. He wasn't even sure if his power had been contained or drained entirely. As everyone waited for Elder Nader to die, the Phoenix turned its face away. It turned around, and its raptor-like gaze locked onto Han Sen and the 2 others on the ground next to him. The hearts of the 3 began to bound. Before they realized what was going on, the Phoenix flapped its wings and flew down the mountain. Oh no! Han Sen suddenly felt sick with fear. Why had that Phoenix suddenly changed its mind, leaving a deified elite to fly toward them instead? The faces of Dragon One and Baolian turned green. Losing all sense of decorum, Dragon One shouted at Baolian, "Mr. Bao, if we don't fight, we don't stand a chance." Baolian's face darkened with frustration. You think I don't want to fight? Have you been paying attention? The power gap is too significant. Even though my king body isn't suppressed, I can't seem to use its power. There is no chance of fighting back. Aren't you a dragon? Don't you call yourself the bravest race? Don't you guys have high resistance to any kind of power? Can you break the suppression on me so that I can activate my king body? Perhaps that way we can get out of this mess. Dragon One sank against his bonds. If I could break free, do you think I would remain here trapped? The discussion was pointless. The 2 of them were locked down there, and neither of them could get free. Dragon One could see that Baolian was useless, so he shouted at Han Sen, "Dollar, if you can escape, take us away now. Do it before it is too late." Han Sen shook his head. Even if he used his super god spirit body to escape, it would only last a second. Once that time was up, the Phoenix's power would be back to suppressing him. He was a dead man, either way. There was nothing that the three of them could do to escape. And by now, the Phoenix had reached them. It landed 10 meters away from the three and looked at Han Sen. No way. There are so many creatures you can eat, but you choose to eat me? I am not Tang Sanzang. What are you staring at me for? Han Sen felt so depressed. He prepared to activate his super god spirit body. Although his chances of escape were low, it was worth a shot. Han Sen was going to wait until the Phoenix asked its question, and as soon as it started speaking, he would use his super god spirit body to teleport away. Perhaps he would survive, somehow. But when the Phoenix opened its beak, it didn't ask a question. The scary suction pulled on Han Sen's body. Oh no, it's all over. Han Sen thought in sudden despair. It was too late for him to use his super god spirit body now. Han Sen thought he was going to be turned into dust, but that wasn't what happened. His body flew through the air toward the Phoenix. Before Han Sen realized what was going on, the Phoenix flapped its wings and shot up into the air beneath Han Sen, catching him on its back. Han Sen was sitting on the white fire, but it didn't feel hot. It was a very warm, relaxing sensation. He felt as if he was sitting in a hot spring. The Phoenix's body had a seemingly limitless life force. The feeling rushed through him, and it made his body feel like old wood receiving life again. His cells were active, and they began to multiply at a much faster rate. What is going on? Han Sen was confused. Baolian, Dragon One, and many of the other creatures that were wrapped up in branches were looking quite confused. They couldn't believe this was happening. They all thought Dollar was going to bite the dust. They would never have guessed that he would end up riding the Phoenix. They all stared at Han Sen in shock, unsure what sort of reaction they should give. After the Phoenix placed Han Sen on its back, it flapped its wings and returned to the wooden bridge. Han Sen sat atop the Phoenix's back. He could tell that the Phoenix didn't hold any hostility toward him. The Phoenix dropped back onto the bridge, landing in front of Elder Nader, who was tied up like a cocoon. The bird's resonating voice played in everyone's head again. You can eat this, the Phoenix said. All around Han Sen, the jaws of the onlookers fell open. Even though the Phoenix hadn't used Elder Nader's name, it was obvious that the bird thought the destroyed would be tasty and nutritious, and he wanted Han Sen to eat the man. You're letting me eat him? Han Sen looked surprised. Yes, he is the best meal here. Are you worried that he won't taste good? That is fine. If so, you can have your pick. Eat anything you want. If you like it, it is yours, the Phoenix said. Looks of confused horror covered the faces of Elder Nader and all the others. They couldn't believe what they were hearing. They had all been trapped in this place, and the Phoenix considered them to be nothing more than food. Dollar, however, had been invited to eat with the Phoenix like a guest of honor. If he wanted to, he could consume them until his belly was full. Although Han Sen had no idea why the Phoenix was treating him differently, he felt as if he was relatively safe now. You're giving them all to me? Han Sen asked, looking at Elder Nader and the others. Of course. Assuming you like them, that is. The Phoenix smiled. It was like a doting mother who had found an opportunity to spoil her kid. It was difficult for Han Sen to comprehend its current behavior, given that he had just watched it toy with the lives of its prisoners. It had turned kings and deifieds into piles of dust with ease. I can do whatever I want of them? I mean, if I don't want to eat them, can I let them go? Han Sen asked. Yes, as long as that is what you want. The Phoenix looked as if it really was spoiling him. Han Sen only wanted to save Dragon One, but then he hesitated. He decided to save Baolian, too. He wanted to beat Baolian by himself. He didn't want the man to die like this before Han Sen could settle the score between them. Then, let those two go. Han Sen pointed at Dragon One and Baolian. When the Phoenix heard Han Sen's request, it didn't move. But Baolian and Dragon One, who were being pressed into the ground, suddenly felt the crushing gravitational force lift from their bodies. Brother Dollar, I really appreciate this, Dragon One declared, his face looking rather shaken. Immediately after he finished speaking, he flew away. He didn't dare stay any longer. What you've done here today will be paid back in full. I owe you one, Bao said. And then, he left with Dragon 1. Mr. Dollar, help? Many elites that were bound to the bridge had seen that the Phoenix agreed to free Dragon 1 and Bao at Dollar's request. They were shocked, but hope quickly dawned in their eyes. A few desperate kings called out to Han Sen for help. I can really do whatever I want with these people? Han Sen asked again, looking at the god Phoenix with uncertainty. Of course. They are all yours, the Phoenix said with a smile. Han Sen squinted and looked at Elder Nader and all the others. He remained silent for a long moment, and his reluctance made everyone worry profusely. Mr. Dollar, please be kind and let us live. I have a family back home to raise, begged a king from a small race. I have no association with your people, and neither am I cooperating with you. Why should I save you? Han Sen looked at the king and spoke coldly. The king immediately answered, I have many xenogenic treasures and genes. I can give them all to you. I just want to live. I will owe you so much. Are you truly willing to do that? I haven't forced you, Han Sen said with a blink. Of course, I'm willing to. I will be eternally thankful if I'm allowed to live. You will be my savior for all time, and I will work my hardest to pay you back, the king quickly said. Mr. Dollar, I am willing to offer you all my treasures and xenogenic genes. Mr. Dollar, please take mine. Suddenly, many kings were fighting to be the ones to give Han Sen treasure. They pleaded with Han Sen to show mercy and let them live. If you guys are being this nice, I won't decline your offers, Han Sen said, his voice slightly awkward. He quickly collected the treasures and xenogenic genes from the kings. And then, he asked the Phoenix to remove the restrictions binding them. The kings were delighted. After they thanked Han Sen, they were quick to escape that place. Brother Dollar, this is all I have. Is it enough to spare my life? Bar said. Bar never saved up much. The only thing of real value that he possessed was a deified saw blade, and it was only at the primitive level. If Brother Bar is willing to give that up, then I will accept it. Han Sen nodded and took Bar's saw blade. The Phoenix then released the restrictions holding Bar. When the deified elites who were present saw Bar give up a deified treasure in exchange for his life, they all decided to follow his example. They were willing to give up their deified treasures in exchange for permission to live. Han Sen turned to the other deifieds with a wolfish grin. He said, Bar and his buddy Diarabber are old clients of mine. That is why he is getting special treatment. If the rest of you would like to purchase your lives, deified treasure alone is not enough. Amazement swept through the deified prisoners. That was especially true of Elder Nader. His face kept warping, shifting from green to white as his emotions vacillated between nausea and rage. Before, he had thought of Dollar as a useless nobody. He refused to team up with Dollar. Who would have known his life would end up in this man's hands? He wasn't optimistic enough to believe that his chances of being saved were 50-50. He probably wouldn't be allowed to live, even if he gave Han Sen everything that he had. As he watched Han Sen scam the other deified elites, Elder Nader's first impression of Han Sen grew deeper. This was a greedy man. Those were the 5 words he would pick to describe Han Sen. This guy is so greedy. No wonder people call him Dollar. Now that the other deifieds were being forced to give up all their prized possessions in exchange for their freedom, they also realized what sort of person Han Sen really was. But losing all their money was better than dying there. It might have been unpleasant, but the deifieds paid up rather quickly. None of them were bold enough to try to bargain with Han Sen. A short time later, Han Sen was a much wealthier man, and all the elites that were bound by the bridge were released. Only Elder Nader remained, and he hadn't said a word thus far. Elder Nader couldn't even move his head to look away. His face was turning a deeper and deeper shade of red, but he didn't say anything. I don't believe you will release everyone from all these races, yet dare to kill me. Killing me in front of all these witnesses is like declaring war upon the destroyed, Elder Nader thought to himself, but still, he did not speak. Mr. Phoenix, thank you for your kindness and generosity. The rest of these people are useless to me. You can have them all. Han Sen bowed to the Phoenix. Elder Nader's mouth fell open, but before he could protest or say anything, the god Phoenix opened its mouth and drew in a breath. Elder Nader turned into clouds of dust. Everyone stared in mute silence. They were terrified by the fact that a transmutation deified had been murdered in an instant, but they were also happy that they had made a smarter decision. If they hadn't coughed up Han Sen's ransom demand, they would have ended up like Elder Nader. Elder Nader stayed at home for too long. He must have forgotten how dangerous the universe is. Even to the moment of his death, he was just thinking about preserving his reputation. Bar shook his head casually, then chuckled a little. Although the destroyed were powerful, they didn't have many deifieds. Losing a transmutation deified like that was a big blow to them. But Elder Nader had been famous for too long. Instead of spending his time fighting for survival in the universe, he had spent the last few hundred years teaching students. He had lost his edge and forgotten how cruel the universe can be. He had taken his reputation too seriously. When everyone was gone, Han Sen bowed to the God Phoenix and said, "Thank you for your help. If there is something you need me to do, I will try my best to help you. If there is nothing else, then I will take my leave." After Han Sen said that, the phoenix picked him up in its beak. It flew deep into the xenogenic space. When the God Phoenix departed, the bridge between the two halves of Two Ape Mountain reverted to its former, lifeless appearance. The branches that had sprouted from it retreated, and its surface began to look like charcoal once more. The black steel bell stopped moving, too. It hung motionless and silent. After the phoenix lifted Han Sen into the air, it rocketed forward with blinding speed. This was nothing like the slow, ponderous way the bird had moved when it first approached Two Ape Mountain. Before Han Sen could say anything, he saw that they were heading toward one of the suns in the sky. The orb glowed with power and heat as they shot recklessly toward it. They were still some distance from the sun, but Han Sen thought that the incredible heat was about to melt his deified body. He didn't know what would happen if he entered that glowing orb, and his heart rose into his throat at the thought. The phoenix flapped its wings, and they shot past the sun, flying deeper into the xenogenic space. The phoenix accelerated, leaving behind the glowing suns that hung threateningly in the sky. Han Sen looked ahead and saw, in the distant sky, a giant sycamore tree that was growing upside down. Han Sen had seen many strange trees in his life before, but he had never seen a tree growing upside down. The top of the giant sycamore tree was on the ground, but its roots were growing into the sky. The roots were like a dragon's beard, all tangled up like a large bird nest. People say phoenixes live in sycamore trees. Perhaps this phoenix doesn't live atop the sycamore tree, but rather in its roots. Han Sen looked at the upside-down growing tree with a strange expression. The god phoenix soared up to the roots and landed deftly among them. The creature opened its beak, letting Han Sen fall into a knot of roots that looked something like a nest. Han Sen quickly discovered that the place wasn't like a bird's nest. It really was a bird's nest. In that bird's nest that was composed of the roots of the tree, Han Sen saw a giant egg that was around 10 meters tall. The egg was burning with the same white fire as the phoenix. "Why have you brought me here? You don't think I look like a phoenix, do you? You're not going to raise me as a child, are you?" Han Sen spoke to the phoenix that was now settling down in the nest. "Of course I know you aren't a phoenix. Phoenixes don't give birth to ugly children like you. And this is my child," the phoenix said proudly. "Then why did you bring me here?" Han Sen let out a long sigh. If he was raised by a phoenix, he would become a phoenix man. "Your body has traces of a presence that belongs to a member of my race. And I must say, it is a nice one. I'm sure you must have been spending a lot of time with a youngster of my race," the phoenix said while looking at Han Sen. "A young phoenix?" Han Sen was shocked. Then he thought of something. With a weird look on his face, he said, "She can't be talking about the little red bird, can she? The little red bird is a hybrid, though. It isn't actually a phoenix." Now Han Sen understood why the phoenix was treating him differently. It was because of the little red bird. "We did spend time together for quite a while, and our relationship is solid. We are kind of like brothers," Han Sen said seriously. Han Sen wasn't going to tell the phoenix that the little red bird was a hybrid. If the phoenix was racist to the hybrid kind, then his special treatment would vanish. Thinking about how cold and cruel the phoenix appeared when it started eating people, Han Sen shuddered. He sincerely hoped the phoenix wouldn't have a change of heart and became callous enough to dine on him. I thought I was the only phoenix remaining in this universe. I didn't suspect there was another one of my kind out there in the universe. The phoenix looked very happy, but then it said, if you can, I hope you will be able to help me. Bring that baby phoenix here. I'm afraid that might be rather difficult. I have been separated from the phoenix for quite a while, and I'm not sure where it is right now. But don't worry. If you want to see it, I will do my best to find him and bring him to you. If you guys are seeking a reunion, I will do my best to make it happen. A reunion with your family will be a beautiful thing. Han Sen could see that the phoenix's expression was growing a little rigid, so he quickly tried to make his voice sound more positive and certain. The phoenix looked very happy again. Don't just try your best. You must bring him here. Don't worry. I will make sure to complete this request, Han Sen agreed. He wanted to trick the phoenix and leave that xenogenic space as soon as possible. Han Sen didn't know if the phoenix could accept a hybrid. He wouldn't risk his safety or the little red birds by actually bringing it there. The phoenix seemed very happy. It extended one of its wings, and Han Sen saw a feather that looked very fiery and white fall through the air. The feather seemed to have a life of its own, and it flew before Han Sen. This phoenix feather is for you. It is my gift for you. If you complete my request, I will reward you with more, the phoenix said seriously. You are so kind. I'm more than flattered to receive this, Han Sen said. Then, he grabbed the fire-wreathed feather in his hand. It was a true god-class treasure. Even a mere feather from the phoenix would be wildly powerful. The feather was pure white, almost transparent. The whole thing looked as if it was made of fire, but it wasn't like a fire that Han Sen couldn't touch. It was actually solid. This fire feather was a small piece of an actual phoenix, but it was still only 1 meter long. When he held it in his hands, though, it looked like a flaming sword. Han Sen grinned widely. He could use the feather as a weapon. Han Sen was lacking a decent weapon right now. This fire feather was perfect for him. The longer he held it, the more he liked it. A fire element fire feather. This should be quite powerful, Han Sen thought to himself. He wasn't going to try out the sword there in the phoenix's nest, though. After he had examined the gift, Han Sen changed the subject. Why are you looking for a baby phoenix? I think that the baby bird is substantially weaker than you. Han Sen was speaking the truth. This phoenix had pure ancestry, and it was a born deified xenogenic. The little red bird was just a hybrid, and it had been very weak when it was born. Compared to a true god xenogenic, it was 180,000 miles behind. The phoenix sighed and said, breeding is difficult for our race. There aren't many of us left, if there are any at all. Up until now, I haven't been able to find another of my kind. I can't believe there is a baby bird alive somewhere. For me and my race, this is great news. Once my child is born, they can become a couple. That way, they should be able to breed. Han Sen froze when he heard that. The phoenix wanted to use the little red bird as a breeding machine. It planned for the little red bird to make babies and repopulate the phoenixes. Hang on, I don't even know if the little red bird is male or female, Han Sen thought. If they are the same sex, how will they make babies? Han Sen didn't say that aloud, however. He only agreed to the request, promising that he would bring the little red bird there. If there is nothing else, I will go and search for the little red bird and bring it here. Han Sen just wanted to get out of there now. There is no rush. Before you leave, there is something very important you must do, the phoenix said. Then, it spat some fire at Han Sen. The phoenix's white flame wrapped around Han Sen in a flash. It made Han Sen look like a burning torch, but it didn't actually sear him. He felt no pain or burning sensation. While the fire looked scary, there was no heat. But within the burning flames, Han Sen's black Dongxian armor started to turn white. Aside from that, Han Sen felt no changes occurring within his body. His Dongxian armor's power wasn't locked or limited. When the fire went out, the Dongxian armor had turned into a white, semi-transparent crystal. It looked like a dream, like something that couldn't possibly exist in the real world. Han Sen's eyes suddenly widened. He generated his Dongxian Sutra power and realized his Dongxian power was activated. With it, he could harness white phoenix fires. Now that you have the phoenix flame's power, you can make effective use of the phoenix feather, the phoenix said with a smile. Han Sen wasn't overjoyed by this, though. His Dongshin Sutra was already fine, but now his armor was linked to the god Phoenix Flame. If he used his Dongshin armor, it would trigger the Phoenix Fire. That seemed like a good thing at first thought. The Phoenix Fires was a high-class power that most people would admire, but it simply wasn't Han Sen's forte. If the Phoenix had placed its Phoenix Flames on the Dongshin armor, it wasn't likely that the fire's only function was allowing Han Sen to use the Phoenix Feather. Although Han Sen immediately thought this, he didn't say anything to the Phoenix. Go. If you can bring back that baby Phoenix, I will allow your people to live here, protected by our race, the Phoenix promised. This place is a smoldering wasteland. Who would want to live here? Han Sen thought to himself. The conditions that the Phoenix had wrought on the land around it didn't seem to be all that inviting. It seemed to understand what Han Sen was thinking, though. The Phoenix continued, explaining, "This is where the Phoenix race started. Now, only I am left. I don't really need much space anymore. If you can bring that baby Phoenix back to me, I will allow you to make use of 1,000,000 miles. You may cultivate it however you see fit, and if an enemy shows up, I promise to help you chase them away." After that, the Phoenix looked across the burned world and said, "After bad things reach their lowest point, good things then tend to rise. This is an incinerated land, but it isn't a dead realm. It can yield benefits beyond your wildest dreams." What kind of benefits? Han Sen couldn't help but ask. Only the dying can live. Death comes first so that newborns can grow. This xenogenic space has extremely potent powers of life. Any creature, whether it is a plant, animal, or xenogenic, will grow better here than they would in the outside world, the Phoenix said. Why don't I feel anything special about this place? Han Sen didn't believe what the Phoenix said because he couldn't feel anything strange going on inside him. He couldn't detect the life force in this xenogenic space doing anything that the Phoenix had just described. "Do you have any seeds?" the Phoenix asked, looking at Han Sen. "I don't have seeds, but I do have a small plant." Han Sen brought out a cactus from Destiny's Tower in a glass pot. "Put it in the soil," the Phoenix said. Han Sen was confused. He took the cactus out of the pot and planted it in the soil. Then, a miracle happened. The cactus had been the size of a fist, but as Han Sen watched, it began to grow. A second later, it was the size of a football, and it was still growing. Any creature that can absorb this extreme living power can grow quickly, just like this plant you have planted. Beneath the extreme living power, a being can develop very fast and reach the max of what one's genes can support. There is only one extreme living land in the universe, and it is here. It belongs to the Phoenixes. There is no other in the universe, the Phoenix said with a cocky look. As the Phoenix spoke, the cactus that Han Sen had planted reached the size of a barrel, and still, it continued to grow. It shocked Han Sen a great deal. He couldn't even explain how staggering this was. Does all the land in this place have power similar to what I'm seeing here? Han Sen asked, looking at the Phoenix in wonder. He knew what that meant. If any creature could grow that rapidly in a certain location, it almost suggested that the area was a glitch. It went against the laws of nature. Yes, the Phoenix said with a nod. Han Sen was speechless. He was so happy to hear that he might be allowed to enter a xenogenic space as profound as that. It would be a great boon for the development of humans. Plus, he would have a true god Phoenix to protect the race. Humans in this universe would be as safe as Tarzan. Aside from the 3 higher races, no one could even attempt to assault the territory protected by the Phoenix. Now, Han Sen was seriously considering handing over the little red bird. "Don't worry, Mr. Phoenix. I'm going to try my best to locate the baby Phoenix. I will bring it to you." Han Sen licked his lips as he spoke. The Phoenix was happy with Han Sen's performance thus far, and it didn't keep him. It told Han Sen that when he located the baby Phoenix, he simply needed to return and ring the black steel bell. Then, the Phoenix would come to pick up Han Sen and the baby Phoenix. Han Sen collected his Phoenix feather and left that nirvana. He was so tempted by the Phoenix's offer that he thought to himself, "It is a shame that the little red bird is a mix. If the Phoenix isn't fond of it, this might turn bad. I shouldn't risk it." Han Sen decided that he wouldn't bring the little red bird there, after all. After departing from the xenogenic space, he traveled a great many leagues away. "The very high don't know that I have escaped," but I'm not going back to Sky Palace. In case the very high have already found out, I should delay the news for as long as I can, Han Sen thought for a while. He was now planning to go back to the god area to hunt deified xenogeneics for a while. That way, he could max out his deified gene tallies. But Han Sen didn't dare stay near the Nirvana. He contacted Xie Qingking and made plans to live with him for a while. Xie Qingking immediately agreed to Han Sen's request. He gave out orders to send ships to collect Han Sen. You don't have to pick me up. I just need to know if it is safe where you are. I'm in trouble, and my identity can't be exposed, Han Sen said. Xie Qingking was chewing on a big cigar. With a pleased look, he said, a while ago, I bought a system that was part of the Sky Music area. There are 2 planets with life, and the views aren't bad. I bought them to use as a vacation home. You should consider living there. The Sky Music area is part of the 1,000 Treasures. They are in charge of defense and security. Unless there is a universal war, I doubt any petty thieves would risk trying to break in. Holy crap! Do you earn that much money from writing comics? Han Sen's eyes were wide open. Xie Qingking had bought an entire system to use as a vacation spot. It was too ridiculous to believe. Call me Teacher Xie. I am the most famous author with the best-selling books ever. The books have millions of fans across millions of races across the entire universe, Xie Qingking said lazily, waving his cigar. Teacher Xie, does your comic studio need any extra hands? Han Sen was practically drooling. It sounded like easy money. Yes, but we don't need people like you who don't have active imaginations. There's also the fact that you're very stingy. Xie Qingking obviously wasn't mincing his words when it came to insulting Han Sen. Han Sen was rendered speechless. His personality was certainly rooted in reality, but he didn't lack imagination. Still, Han Sen had to admit that he had no artistic capabilities. Shaking his head, he struck an agreement with Xie Qingking and went to the man's vacation planet. Although he already knew Xie Qingking was very rich, after seeing the system that the man had purchased, Han Sen was well and truly flabbergasted. That was especially true when he saw Xie Qingking piloting a ZT-27 Ming King battleship to pick him up. Han Sen suddenly doubted that Xie Qingking had earned all this dough just by selling comics. The man had to be selling weapons on the black market or something. That battleship had once belonged to the Extreme King. It was the type of battleship only their kings could use. Ordinarily, only princes, princesses, and other royals were allowed to pilot such powerful ships. Although it was a small battleship compared to what some races possessed, the equipment, tools, and weapons on board were the best in the universe. That was especially true of its defenses. It could withstand the strikes of a primitive deified without even having its paint scratched. This wasn't something you could buy in your average street market. The Extreme King Prince Chrisman is a fan of my books. This was a gift he sent me, in exchange for the latest edition in my series. Xie Qingking looked and sounded so proud when he saw Han Sen's open-jawed astonishment. You cow! Han Sen gave him a thumbs up. He had nothing else to say. He really did admire his old friend's success. There were a lot of humans, spirits, and creatures who had crossed over from the sanctuary in recent times, but he was certain Xie Qingking had been the most successful. But the key for him reaching this monetary zenith was a vast amount of self-determination. He got there himself, and he hadn't relied on anyone. Han Sen admired that. Snowball, who was sitting next to Xie Qingking, had received a complete makeover. It was wearing all sorts of fancy stuff. Even the dog tags on its neck were famous in the universe. It had a small gentleman's hat upon its head, which just so happened to be a high-class treasure. Aside from the word rich, Han Sen didn't know how to describe the pair. Old Han, have you ever thought about making your own mountain? Xie Qingking tossed an arm around Han Sen's shoulders and passed him a cigarette. What kind of mountain? We aren't some sort of gang. Han Sen rolled his eyes. Xie Qingking's eyes were serious. That is precisely what I mean. Although my work is going well, the more I work, the more empty I feel. In this universe, I don't have a true place to call home. I don't have a territory. Everything within reach is controlled by others. And if I was ever to offend the wrong people, they could take away everything I own with a mere wave of their hands. That feeling sucks. Aren't you rich? Can't you just buy an abandoned system and build it up? Han Sen said. Xie Qingqing drew a long breath through his cigar and puffed out some smoke rings. Then he gnashed his teeth and said, "That won't do us *T. Without enough power to support us, having a territory is no different from having no territory." "Then what are you suggesting?" Han Sen had actually been planning this for a long time. It had long been his goal to mark out territory for himself in the universe. But there were many issues going on in the universe right now. Even if they were to take over a xenogeneic space, they might not be able to hold it. Xie Qingqing seemed to be prepared for that question. He turned on a hologram and revealed a map of the universe. He pointed at part of the map and said, "Would you like to join me in taking a gamble? If we win, this big place will belong to us. What if we lose?" Han Sen asked, looking at that place. "Then we will just end up bankrupt and have to start all over," Xie Qingqing said with a laugh. "Tell me about your plan." Han Sen's eyes were locked on that space. The two words read Space Garden. It was a xenogeneic space in the universe that belonged to the flower god race. The flower gods weren't a high race, and Space Garden was just a medium-sized xenogeneic space. In regards to their abilities, the flower gods didn't have the power or resources that the high races did. The flower god people were just good at making genofluids, and making genofluids had given them a higher stake in the greater universe. Even the top 10 high races couldn't replicate the genofluids they made. It wasn't like their genofluid skills were better than those of the higher races. Space Garden simply offered many nutritious genes. The resources that they used could only be obtained in the Space Garden. The Space Garden wasn't very big, but it had very special rules. As long as the flower gods held onto the Space Garden and didn't leave, the three highest races couldn't set foot there. While the flower gods made a lot of fantastic genofluids, their combat powers were rather weak. They had been working hard to improve themselves for many years, and at this point, no one knew how many genofluids they had produced and consumed. But there were no deified elites growing amongst them. They didn't have the power to become one of the high races. But the flower gods weren't to blame for their weakness. Fighting wasn't what their genes had been developed for. They just didn't have the right genes for combat, so it didn't matter how many genofluids they consumed. No deified elites would rise amongst them. On top of that, many factions were suppressing them. Again and again, they were stopped from trying to become one of the higher races. Because the flower gods knew they couldn't become stronger, they sought a lot of outside powers to bolster their own. Normally, if a race wanted to start a lantern war, all of their fighters had to share the same blood. If an outsider joined the fight, even if they beat the higher race, the lantern would refuse to light. But the flower gods had recently developed an intriguing genofluid. If one was to use that genofluid, they could temporarily possess the blood of a flower god. If a deified elite used that genofluid, they could be considered a flower god for a while and help the flower gods earn a slot amidst the higher races. The adopted warrior could light the lantern on the flower god's behalf. But such a powerful genofluid could only be used once due to the resources it cost. Even the flower gods couldn't keep producing that sort of concoction. Therefore, they were currently considering which deified elite would be willing to help them become a high race. People were evil. Even deified elites that had been friendly to the flower gods couldn't be trusted now. Therefore, the flower gods were hesitating to make a decision. They couldn't decide which elite to trust. The gamble Xie Qingqing was talking about was in regards to the Space Garden. He wanted to get the Space Garden for himself. That was Xie Qingqing's scheme. If he was able to claim the Space Garden, then even if the three higher races came for him, it would be pointless. As long as the Space Garden was in their hands, no outsider could enter. If the three high races cannot take the Space Garden, how can we claim it? Han Sen looked at Xie Qingqing and asked. The flower gods aren't talented fighters. They own the Space Garden, which is a nice place. They also have great technology that helps them produce genofluid. Many of the higher races want it. They want to own the flower gods, but sadly, the Space Garden has its special rules. In all this time, none of the higher races have found a way to invade them. After pausing, Xie Qingqing went on to say, the puppeteers in the shadows cannot enter the Space Garden, but they do not want the flower gods to become a higher race. They are afraid that if the fitness of the flower gods was improved, their race would become dangerous. So, they are trying to suppress the flower gods every way they can. Although the flower gods have the potential to become a high race, they are forced to remain a low race. That means that if the flower gods want to become a high race, they have to do more than just beat another high race, Han Sen said with a frown. You are right. Otherwise, looking for a deified elite that could help them wouldn't take much time. But looking for one that could sort out all of their issues and not affect the reputation of the flower gods? That is hard. If the elite was too weak, there wouldn't be enough power to help them become a high race. If the elite was too strong, the flower gods wouldn't feel safe. Therefore, the flower gods have been unable to decide which elite can help them. Right now, the pickings are slim for the flower gods, but they are also offering a lot to the person they hire. If someone helps them become a high race, they will share the space garden with their new ally. Xie King pointed at the map with a look of excitement. The guy we need to talk to is called Violet. He is the spokesperson for the flower gods. The deified elites of many races have been trying to get in contact with him, so they can try their hand at earning half of the space garden. Xie King punched a command into his display to reveal the image of a flower god. Is it a male or a female? Han Sen looked at the flower god in the video. It looked somewhat like a very gorgeous human, but a flower rose from its head. This flower was a violet. It is a male. In the flower gods, both the men and women look very beautiful. Don't think that Violet is weak because of his beauty, however. He is actually very strong. He isn't simple-minded or easily influenced. I have contacted him before, and he is a tricky guy to negotiate with, Xie King said. If he was easy to push around, I doubt the flower gods would let him deal with such important matters. After all, this decision will be a pivotal part of the flower gods becoming a higher race. If they fail, their entire race could be destroyed. They need to be careful with such matters. Han Sen paused and then asked, which race do the flower gods wish to replace? I don't know yet. The flower gods are being very careful, and they don't leak information easily. Judging from what others have guessed, they would likely seek to take out the tree men that are next to them. The flower gods and the tree men have been in conflict for a long time, so they are already enemies. Furthermore, the tree men have been doing poorly in recent times. It has been a few hundred years since they had a deified in their race. They aren't exactly a powerful high race. They would be one of the easier races to knock down a peg. There are a few other targets, too. Xie King brought up all the information he had on the subject. Do these high races not have any allies? Han Sen asked, tapping his lip in thought. Yes, but because they aren't very strong, people don't take them seriously. Plus, the flower gods have connections with the ancient god. If they want to fight, it's unlikely that others would interfere. Xie King pointed out more information about Violet. He then pointed at the man's image and said, now, this guy is the key that we need. All we need to do is convince him, and then we will be partnered with the flower gods and earn half of Space Garden. Xie King smiled at Han Sen and said, the crystallizers aren't thought of as a strong race. I don't think the flower gods will worry too much about you completely overpowering them. And then, all you need to do is use your power to impress Violet. Why don't you go there on your own? Han Sen didn't seem satisfied. I wanted to go, but I'm not deified yet, Xie King confessed hopelessly. He opened his palms. So, sometimes there are things you can't do yourself?
Han Sen left.
Xie King stared back at Han Sen and said, it isn't that I can't. It's that I can't do it yet. Han Sen stayed on Xie King's planet for a few days. The environment wasn't too shabby. It was almost like heaven. If it was a peaceful period, it wouldn't be a bad choice to retire there for good. Every day, Han Sen used the 4-sheep cube to access God's farm. He was hoping to see Warner and God's knife again. But even though a lot of time had passed, Han Sen had yet to see them again. It was strange. Han Sen was initially worried that if he used the 4-sheep cube, he would be thrown back to the very high. But now he noticed that no matter where he was, he would travel to God's farm and then return to where he last used the cube. With things like that, it also meant he had no way of returning to the bottle world. If the very high went to visit him, they would learn that he had escaped. In fact, Han Sen's escape had already been discovered. A very high elder had planned to give Han Sen another full-body checkup, but when he went into the bottle world, he was unable to find Han Sen. This surprised the very high a lot. Han Sen had escaped from their Alpha Hall without anyone noticing. As far as they were concerned, this was very bad. But the Very High now believed someone must have helped Han Senator otherwise. How could he have escaped? Exquisite was initially their prime suspect, since she had done it once before. But after a thorough investigation, they realized that it couldn't have been Exquisite. After confirming that it wasn't Exquisite, matters became more complicated. They believed there was a traitor in the Very High that their investigation had failed to uncover. He really escaped. Exquisite was more shocked than any of the other Very High. She hadn't believed Han Sen when he insisted that he would get out on his own. But a short time after she had last seen him, Han Sen had done as he promised. This was quite unbelievable. Han Sen had been imprisoned by the Very High, the top race in the universe. Not even true god elites could escape from the Alpha Hall once they were trapped there. She couldn't imagine how Han Sen had managed to do what he had done. The Very High tried to predict where Han Sen might go, and they used some special geno-arts of deduction, but they were unable to catch his trail. They hadn't the faintest trace of a clue as to where he had fled. That made the Very High even more certain that there was a traitor in their midst. If there wasn't a traitor, Han Sen would have been tracked down by now, they believed. Han Sen, in the meantime, had just been introduced to Violet of the Flower Gods. The guy looked just as he had in the hologram. The man was so pretty that he could make a country fall. But a pretty face like that didn't influence Han Sen much. He felt like Violet was too soft, and it gave him the impression that the man was actually a toxic snake. Soft on the exterior, but filled to the brim with evil and poison. The prettier the snake is, the more toxic it is. I wonder how dangerous this Violet truly is. Han Sen wondered to himself. You said Violet hosted a banquet and invited many deified elites from all sorts of races? What does that mean? Han Sen lowered his voice to ask Xie Qingqing next to him. I don't know. Xie Qingqing fell silent, and then he said, maybe he wants to put the cooperation up as an auction and have deified elites compete with each other. See who comes up with the highest price and whatnot. No way. That would be ridiculous. This decision will decide the fate of the whole race of the Flower Gods. They can't host an auction for something this serious unless the people in charge of the Flower Gods are absolutely nuts. Han Sen shook his head. In that case, I don't know. Aside from that, I can't really think of a reason that they would bring so many deified elites together. Contacting them via private means would be more beneficial. Xie Qingqing really didn't understand much about politics. Han Sen looked around. He saw a few people he already knew. There was Dragon One from the Dragons, and Dia Robber from the Destroyed, by Wanjie from the Extreme King. Even Lone Bamboo was there. And there were many other deified elites Han Sen did not know. It looks like the Space Garden is a juicy morsel for a lot of races. There were so many competitors. Han Sen didn't think he would be the one to be contracted. These big races are like hungry wolves circling prey. The Flower King might not want to cooperate with them. We still stand a chance. Although Xie Qingqing said that, seeing people like that all around, he knew how important the Space Garden was to everyone. It had exceeded his expectations, and he knew it wouldn't be an easy prize to win. I'm sorry to have asked everyone to convene here today, but I'm afraid the Flower Gods have a problem. I regret to inform you that our plans have changed. To prevent everyone from thinking the Flower Gods are not reliable, we have asked everyone to come here so we can explain things in person. Violet's words were shocking to everyone in attendance. What happened to the Flower Gods? Is there any way in which I can help? Extreme King Prince by Wanjie quickly said. He had just become deified not too long ago. He was only primitive, so he definitely wasn't the highest-ranking deified that was present. Far from it. He was a crown prince of the Extreme King, however. He was one of the most qualified emissaries who had come to this meeting. Thank you for your concern, Crown Prince. Our race needs a favor. I want to invite you all to enter the Space Garden so that you can help my people. A stunned silence descended over the meeting. The Flower Gods had never let outsiders into the Space Garden. They wanted to keep it for themselves. People only knew that the Space Garden was full of high-level genofluid resources. As for what it looked like inside, hardly anyone other than the Flower Gods had ever seen it. Across history, only a few outsiders had been allowed to enter the Space Garden, and they were very close with the Flower Gods. But the elites who had come to this meeting barely had any connection to the flower gods. Despite the fact that they were practically strangers, the flower gods were inviting them all to spend time in the space garden. The whole situation was quite strange. Violet seemed to know that everyone would think of this as suspicious, and so he quickly said, "The talents of my people aren't the only reason that we are able to create such unique genofluids. The primary reason, in truth, is that the space garden provides us access to resources not available to any other race. Therefore, no one has been able to copy the genofluids that we make." "Are you saying that something has happened to the resources that you use to create your products?" Dragon 1 asked Violet, tilting his head to one side. Upon hearing that, everyone thought what Dragon 1 said made sense. If there wasn't some issue with the resources of the space garden, Violet wouldn't be speaking so openly about the secrets of the flower gods. Violet nodded and said, "There is a very serious problem, and if we do not sort this out, I'm afraid the flower gods will no longer be able to create the special high-class genofluids that we are famous for." "What is the problem? You can tell us." "There are many elites here, and even the Extreme King's crown prince." "We can help you," Robber said. "Yes, we will find a way to help you, together. We will not allow the genofluids of the flower gods to go extinct. That would be a great loss for the entire universe." Everyone was trying to show earnest support. But more than anything, they just wanted to learn the secrets of the genofluids. They were only offering aid because of the benefits they would receive. No one would help the flower gods for no reason. Violet sighed and said, "I really want to tell you all so that we can sort out this problem quickly, but this information is a matter of national security to the flower gods. The leader has commanded us not to tell anyone. Otherwise, we could be exiled." "Violet, what is that supposed to mean? You asked us to come here, but now you're not telling us anything. In that case, how are we supposed to help?" demanded a deified elite with a short temper. Violet's face looked glum. He sighed and said, "The flower gods would like all of you to come to the space garden to help our race. But before you enter the space garden, I cannot tell you what is going on there. I know this is rude, but we have no choice. What is happening is too important for my people, and so we cannot risk leaking our secrets. You aren't telling us anything, and yet you want our help? How are we supposed to know if we can help?" Bai Wanjie said, "We know this is very awkward for everyone involved, and if you don't want to enter, we won't try to force you. We would rather let our resources be destroyed than allow our secrets to become public knowledge," Violet said. "What you're saying doesn't make sense. Even if you don't tell us now, we will still learn your secrets once we go in." "Yes. So, you must tell us now. And then, when we go, we will find a way." But no matter what people said, Violet was stalwart. He wasn't going to give them a single detail. "There's really no point in continuing this conversation. If you really want to help us, our race will pay you back. We will do everything in our power to return the favor. If you aren't willing to help, then that is also fine. But right now, this situation is an urgent one. I need to return to the space garden with haste. Anyone who is willing to help us can journey to the space garden with me now. Otherwise, we will part ways here and hope that we can meet again someday." Everyone was talking quietly amongst themselves. They had never expected something like this to occur. But quickly, someone spoke up, agreeing to help the flower gods despite the lack of information. The person walked over to join Violet. Han Sen and Qing King looked at each other. They seemed to know this was how things were going to be. Everyone was interested in the secrets of the flower gods. Otherwise, they never would have come in the first place. Now, there was a chance for everyone here to see the secrets with their own two eyes. No one would miss out on a chance like this. Even if there was a conspiracy at play, the flower gods were a small race. They didn't have any deified elites to wreak serious harm upon the elites that had gathered here. The flower gods depended on the space garden and the genofluids they produced. That was their only claim to fame. The elites who had come to this meeting were mostly deifieds, so they weren't afraid of anything the flower gods might do. Even if the flower gods were planning something devious, the elites believed that their powers would be enough to escape whatever mischief might befall them. "Are we going?" Han Sen asked Qing King. "Since we are already here, it isn't like we can simply leave. Let's follow and have a peek, so we can see what our future territory might look like." Qing King shrugged his shoulders as he spoke. You are right.
Han Sen nodded.
But now, he was playing the role of Xie Qingqing's subordinate. He couldn't speak out of turn, and so he had to let Xie Qingqing do the talking. Violet wasn't turning anyone away. He was more than happy to accept anyone who was willing to go to the space garden with him. Kings and deifieds alike were joining the crowd that was preparing to leave. Before they headed out, Violet told them that the trip would be a very dangerous one. They needed to think this through carefully and make sure that they wished to come. However, in the end, every elite that had come to the meeting decided to follow Violet. They all entered the Flower God's battleship and left the planet that belonged to the Thousand Treasures. Han Sen and Xie Qingqing were inside, as well. Because there was a mix of high races and low races, it was a real melting pot. All that diversity also meant that Xie Qingqing and Han Sen didn't stand out too much. As Han Sen and Xie Qingqing were getting a bite to eat in the battleship's restaurant, Diarabber approached. He seemed excited to see Xie Qingqing. Are you the author of Overbearing President Love Luov, Teacher Xie? I am Xie Qing. Xie Qingqing had gotten used to this sort of thing happening. He smiled amiably as he spoke. It really is Mr. Xie. This is great. I have finally met Teacher Xie. I am a big fan of your comics. Diarabber passionately grabbed Xie Qingqing by the hand. Han Sen was frozen. Diarabber was the future of the destroyed. He was a guy who could kill people with a wave of his hand. He was also a fan of Xie Qingqing. It was hard for Han Sen to wrap his mind around. Is this guy for real? Han Sen wondered. He never would have thought that someone like Diarabber would like comics. The destroyed was probably just looking for an excuse to get close to Xie Qingqing. Teacher Xie, can I have your signature? Diarabber asked, whipping out a pen and paper and holding them out so that Xie Qingqing could jot down his signature. Of course, Xie Qingqing said in a friendly tone. He grabbed the pen and started to write his signature. He wrote his name like a dragon and a phoenix that were flying together. Why did his signature look like a dragon and a phoenix dancing? Han Sen couldn't tell what words they were supposed to be, or if they were even words at all. They were jumbled and looked conjoined. No one could have read what Xie Qingqing had written. Diarabber looked as if he had found a treasure. He took it very seriously and carefully hid the notepad back within his clothing. Mr. Xie, unless it is truly necessary, I suggest that you do not go to the flower gods, Diarabber suddenly said to Xie Qingqing with a hushed voice. Why is that? Xie Qingqing glanced at Diarabber with a raised eyebrow. Since the battle powers of the flower gods are extremely low, they focus their efforts on protecting their space garden. In all the time that their race has lived here, very few outsiders have ever been able to access the space garden. Now it seems like they're letting everyone in. Don't you think that is a little suspicious? Diarabber said as he sat down. It really is quite suspicious. Do you know anything about what is going on? Xie Qingqing asked with some curiosity. Diarabber shook his head. Not really. But from what I have experienced in the past, I am inclined to believe that this will be a very dangerous trip. Teacher Xie, you are a man of great knowledge. There is no need for you to risk your life. It is fine. It is fine. There are some places I wouldn't dare to go, but with him protecting me, going to the flower god should be okay, Xie Qingqing said, tipping a thumb toward Han Sen. Diarabber could see the confidence Xie Qingqing had in his guard, and so he looked at Han Sen and asked, I have never formally met you before. Who are you? This is my bodyguard, Sanmu. He is such a skilled fighter that he can battle 2 or 3 deifieds at once. Xie Qingqing was bluffing and hyping Han Sen up already. Sanmu, if you have earned the admiration of Teacher Xie, you must be a very powerful person. I wonder where you are from, Brother Sanmu. Diarabber didn't use a Geno art to analyze Han Sen, but he noticed that he couldn't feel or discern Han Sen's presence. That surprised him. I'm just from a nameless race. You wouldn't know them, so it wouldn't matter even if I told you, Han Sen muttered, his voice dismissive and short. Xie Qingqing looked at Diarabber and laughed. Don't worry about it. He has a bad temper. He's always like that, I'm afraid. Even to his boss. There is nothing that can be done about it. It's fine. People with power can get away with more than most. Just like Teacher Xie said, if Brother Sanmu can beat 3 enemies at once, then it's understandable even if he is a little abrupt. Diarabber let out a slight chuckle. Even though you say he is good, I think he is just good at bluffing and being a D**ck, said a provocative voice behind them. The three of them looked over to its source, and they found that the voice had come from another table. There were two extreme kings, one of whom was the crown prince by Wanjia. The other person was a young girl. She had a very intriguing and powerful presence, but judging from her age, there was no way she could have been deified already. She was the one who had spoken. Han Sen and the other two at his table had experienced a lot in their lives. Unlike ordinary young people, they weren't easily riled. They weren't going to argue with the little girl. They just pretended not to hear her and resumed talking. The little girl, upon seeing that her declaration received no response from Han Sen, grew bored with the thought of taunting them further. She stopped trying to rile others up. Because Violet had needed to cram everyone into a small battleship, there were a lot of deifieds in one place. It was only natural that arguments might arise. Fortunately, everyone had assembled there for a singular purpose. Until they reached the space garden, no all-out fights would break out. Han Sen tried to memorize the route to the space garden, so he could recall how to get back there if he ever needed to. But the battleship was moving too quickly. After a few space jumps, Han Sen lost track of where he was. Once they entered the xenogeneic space of the flower gods, Han Sen finally understood why the place was called the Space Garden. What Han Sen saw was blankets of flowers covering sprawling meadows. The flower fields looked like stairs rising between the clouds. There were loads of weird flowers scattered everywhere that Han Sen looked. All of them were xenogeneic plants of various levels. It was unbelievably pretty. The ship parked next to the flower fields, and then Violet brought them down. After they left the battleship, Han Sen smelled the scent of all those flowers. While the fragrance was very strong, it wasn't cloying or overbearing. It had a natural tinge to it. Is this a canna lily? Robber asked suddenly, looking at a particular flower. Han Sen and Xie King followed Robber's gaze. There was a flowery vine that was 1/2 meter long. A few flowers had sprouted from the vine, and each bloom looked like a little girl practicing ballet. They looked very pretty. Yes, that is a canna lily. You have a good pair of eyes. Violet gave Robber a thumbs up, but Robber didn't seem to be happy about his discovery. In fact, he looked rather glum. After everyone's focus turned away from Robber to move forward, Han Sen walked over to Robber's side and asked, "What is it?" Robber frowned and said, "From what I can tell, canna lilies should be deified plants. They grow in very unique environments, and their powers are never weaker than a primitive deified xenogeneic. The flower gods just grow them randomly on the side of the road. Isn't that a little too strange? It is surprising to learn that the flower gods can grow deified plants with such ease," Xie King said with a frown. Violet kept moving. Han Sen and the others walked past countless flowers and fields of grass. There were so many varieties of plants, and Han Sen could only recognize a tiny fraction of them. But judging from the life force of the grasses and flowers, he could feel that they were nothing ordinary. They were all xenogeneic plants. None of these plants are ordinary. No wonder the flower gods can create so many genofluids. Han Sen kept looking around him. He didn't know what most of the plants were called, but he could tell from their life force that they were some good stuff. This is such a nice place. If we can take over this territory, we would never have to worry about resources. The xenogeneic plant resources here could feed 100,000 people, Xie King murmured to Han Sen. Han Sen was thinking about something else, though. He ignored Xie King. Xenogeneic plants bear fruit from time to time. As long as the seeds inside a fruit are not damaged, I can take them to the land of the fire phoenix to grow. I don't know how much that would reduce their growing time, though. Han Sen couldn't imagine how much he would gain if he could accelerate the growth of plants like this. If he brought a few seeds to the extreme living land, he could reap enormous quantities of xenogeneic fruit in a short amount of time. Then, he would most certainly become rich. We are nearing the place where the incident happened. Please be careful. Violet's footsteps slowed. Don't we need to meet the leader of your race first? Dragon One asked with suspicion. The leader and the others are already there, Violet said. He kept walking as he talked, so no one slowed down and they all continued following. Something is wrong. How come we have traveled all this way, but we have yet to encounter a single other flower god. Xie Qing King frowned and lowered his voice to speak with Han Sen. Han Sen had noticed the same thing. Violet was the only flower god they had seen this entire time. The only other people around them were members of other races. Since being in the space garden, they had yet to see a single other flower god. This was the home of the flower gods. Even if something had happened, they still should have been encountering other members of Violet's race. Everyone had warning sirens blaring in their heads. They followed Violet carefully as they flew through the space garden, but they didn't see anything dangerous around. And there was no sign of a battle either. It looked as if nothing concerning had actually happened. But when they reached the highest flower field, what they saw froze them in place. They saw many men and women with their bodies buried in the field. Only half their heads were sticking up above the soil. Each of them had a flower on their heads. Some of them were peonies, and some looked like chrysanthemums. Each flower was unique, and they all looked like they were opening in bloom. Clearly, the people who looked like carrots in the flower fields were the missing flower gods. Violet, what is this? Bai Wanjie asked Violet. The flower gods buried in the ground were still alive, but they were as still as half-buried vegetables. Ever so slowly, their life forces seemed to be waning. I'm not going to lie to you, Mr. Crown Prince. The whole of the flower gods, myself excluded, are here, Violet said as he pointed at the half-buried heads in the field. Bai Wanjie didn't ask how the flower gods had ended up in such a strange situation. Instead, he asked Violet, before you left the space garden, were they already buried this way? You are very smart, Mr. Crown Prince. Violet nodded and admitted this to be the case. So, when you said that the flower gods wanted to become a higher place, it was all a lie? A trick that you used to lure us here? Bai Wanjie asked, staring at Violet. Yes. Violet nodded again. He clearly didn't intend to hide anything. Violet and Bai Wanjie just stared at each other. They didn't look away. Violet went on to say, although I lied about the cause, I truly intend to offer you the prize that I promised. If any of you can save my people, we are willing to sign a contract that will offer up half of the space garden. Is that true? Everyone's eyes brightened. You guys have seen what has happened to the flower gods. Do you think we have the gall, let alone the power, to break our promise? Violet drawled. He wasn't in a hurry. What happened to your people? Can you explain it to us now? Bai Wanjie looked at the heads protruding from the flower fields. The fields were indescribable. Flower gods were planted in the soil as far as the eye could see. There were millions of them, and with the small flowers rising from each head, they looked so pretty. It didn't matter how pretty they were, though. They were half buried in the soil, which made the whole scene rather disturbing. Violet was no longer trying to withhold information. For the first time since they had met him, Violet explained what happened completely. The flower gods were good at gardening, and they had discovered the space garden long ago. It was a suitable place for many xenogeneic plants to grow. They thought they had lucked out, but they soon found out that there was something wrong with the xenogeneic space. The leader of the flower gods buried himself in the flower fields, just like Han Sen and the others were seeing now. The flower gods didn't know why their leader did that, but they eventually figured out what was going on. They needed to appease the garden itself. Every once in a while, they would bring sacrifices to the garden. That way, the garden would no longer mess with their minds. As long as they kept the garden satisfied, it wouldn't force any of the flower gods to bury themselves. But as time went by, the space garden seemed to become hungrier. It required more xenogeneics to support itself. 2 months ago, the sacrifice that they buried in the flower fields was useless. The flower god leader and many elites suddenly dug holes in the field and buried themselves there. Aside from Violet, every flower god was now buried there. Why didn't you guys bury yourselves as they did? Asked a small race deified as he looked on Violet with suspicion. Clearly, he didn't believe the tale that Violet was spinning. I don't know. Only I was okay. I don't feel any danger. And I don't know why this happened. That is why I am begging you all to save my people. We will never turn back on our word, Violet said with a look of seriousness. Have you tried digging them out? A king-class elite asked. That question was kind of pointless. The flower gods had been buried there for a while. Violet must have tried everything already. Violet would only have contacted outside deifieds if he had no other choice. He had exhausted all of his options. I can't dig them up. The soil might seem normal, but it is incredibly durable. You cannot dig through this land, and you might even hurt the people in the soil, Violet answered. One of the elites tried to grab a handful of the soil. The eyes of everyone watching widened. The kings, and even the deifieds, couldn't summon enough power to rip out a chunk of that turf. What kind of soil is this? Why is it so resilient? A king-class elite asked in shock. I don't know. When they dug the holes to bury themselves, it didn't seem that difficult. But when I tried digging them out, I couldn't dislodge even a tiny piece of the ground. Violet explained the situation to them once. The elites tried many tests, but each attempt to crack this puzzle failed. They were unable to free the denizens of the flower fields. Many of the elites focused on the task with feverish intensity. They thought of all kinds of methods, trying to get the half-buried flower gods out. But their efforts accomplished nothing. All of their attempts were fruitless. One deified elite even grabbed a flower god by the head. The flower god's neck almost broke, and he still didn't move an inch. The elites were there to save people, not kill them. So, the deified elite stopped trying to yank the head out. Sanmu, what do you think is going on here? Xie King turned and asked Han Senator. He didn't know what to make of the half-buried flower gods. It's a bit creepy, to say the least. Han Sen squinted slightly as he spoke. He was checking out those half-buried flower gods, but he seemed to notice something weird. It's almost like the entire space garden is giving off a life force. What if the space garden itself is a giant creature? When Han Sen came up with an answer, it was something that not even he could believe. If anyone here can save our race, we will give you a key to half the space garden, Violet declared once again. He was keen on making promises, it seemed. Half of its entirety will be shared. That is our pledge. The group of elites had all reached the space garden via the Flower God's battleship. They weren't aware of the route they took to get there, or even how they had made it through the border of the xenogenic space. Because of that, they still didn't know if entry to the space garden required some special password or technique. So, even if they took down the space garden now, there was no point in doing so if they wouldn't be able to find or enter it again. As a result, no one tried anything suspicious or hostile. Based on what Violet had said, it seemed that something special was required to enter the space garden. And that made everyone think. This was obviously a very difficult and vulnerable moment for the flower gods. But if Violet had dared to bring them all here anyway, then that had to mean he had contingencies in place. He couldn't simply be carrying a special item on his person that would allow them to access the space garden at a later date. All the deified elites were looking at the half-buried flower gods, and as they did, Han Sen was also thinking. Then, he leapt into the air and flew up into the sky. He wanted to look down on the space garden from above and see what it looked like from a bird's eye view. But as Han Sen flew, he noticed a shadow flying alongside him. Someone else had obviously had the same thought. That shadow noticed Han Sen, too. They glanced at each other, and Han Sen realized it was the little girl that had been following by Wanjia. They had met briefly in the battleship's canteen. The girl didn't look any older than Bai Wanjia, but the crown prince seemed to respect her a great deal, judging from the way that he treated her. Han Sen couldn't correctly guess her identity. The Bai family had many princes and princesses, and Han Sen had never been able to meet them all. And there were many other members of the royal family as well, not to mention that Han Sen had seen only a few of the extreme king superiors. "What are you doing up here?" the girl asked with a lift of her lips. "I am admiring the view," Han Sen replied with a smile. "Humph, you are weird." The girl turned away from Han Sen and continued flying high. Han Sen knew how to teleport, but if he used it openly, some of the elites might recognize it as God's wonder. He didn't want other people to see it, so he didn't use it there. The space garden was only the size of a planet, but that didn't affect its rare and unique properties. When Han Sen flew high enough to see the whole of the space garden, he was stunned to discover that the entire place was like a giant Ganoderma lucidum mushroom with many layers. The flower fields were like steps, and they were all a part of that mushroom. It was put together with an amazing level of detail and complexity. Now, Han Sen was able to confirm his guess. The space garden could very well be alive. Maybe it was a very high-level planet xenogeneic. Growing plants on a plant xenogeneic seemed quite unbelievable, now that he really considered the idea. But Han Sen had seen all the beings that lived within the black hole spider before. This was certainly possible. "What do you see?" the extreme king girl asked, flying over next to Han Sen. "I see a big mushroom." Han Sen smiled. "Humph. You were boasting about your strength when we were on the battleship, and yet, you cannot see anything." The girl lifted her lips. "So, do you see what's actually going on?" Han Sen asked. "Of course." The little girl looked quite cocky. She patted herself on the chest. "You are too young to see anything." Han Sen pretended not to believe her. The girl shot him an arch look, and she said, "Being older doesn't mean someone is better. Just like you. You have eyes, but you are still blind. You cannot see anything." "Then tell me what you see," Han Sen said. Full of confidence, the girl said, "Of course. If I see it correctly, the space garden itself is a giant plant. It is a very high-level xenogeneic. It could even be true God class. But its life force is so weak, it looks as if it is going to die soon." Violet said that when the flower gods made geno fluids a long time ago, they used a special material that was native to this region. I didn't believe it back then, but I sure am starting to now. If this is a true God-class xenogeneic plant, the xenogeneic plants that grow inside it will adopt its elements. Even an ordinary species that develops here will become different from those on the outside. The girl really did seem to know her stuff. Just like Han Sen, she seemed to think the space garden was one large xenogeneic plant. Han Sen looked at the little girl with shock, and he thought to himself, the Extreme King really are different. With their knowledge and their power, they really are much better than smaller races. If you think the space garden is a true god plant, then what do you make of all the flower gods that are buried in the field? Han Sen asked. The girl really liked how amazed Han Sen was, and she answered, "That is difficult to judge. It could be that the xenogeneic plant knows it is dying, and thus, it is trying to collect more energy to keep itself alive. Either that, or the flower gods themselves signed a contract with the xenogeneic plant. Right now, the xenogeneic plant is going to die, so the flower gods must die with it. There are many possibilities, but until we learn more, it will be difficult to tell which explanation is correct. In that case, how do we find out the truth?" Han Sen was truly flabbergasted this time. The Extreme King had many resources, but such powerful materials still took time to absorb. This girl was so young, and so, he was surprised that she had so much knowledge. The girl thought for a moment and said, "The only way to learn more is to dig up the flower god people. And then, if we fully examine their bodies, we are bound to learn a clue or two." "That is easier said than done. Didn't you see the power of those deified elites? Even they could not dig up the soil in that garden." Han Sen lifted his lips. He had been infected by the girl's mannerisms, it seemed. He had already adopted her gestures. The girl glanced at the field with disdain. "You underestimate the deified elites. I don't know about any others, but I know for sure that Bai Wanjie is not that useless. If he thinks hard enough, he'll find a way to excavate the flower gods. The only thing that matters, following that, is the fact that whoever we excavate will probably die. With my knowledge of him, I think he is going to strike gold real soon. Isn't Bai Wanjie your senior?" Han Sen asked when he noticed that the girl wasn't using an honorific when she referred to Bai Wanjie. This weirded him out, and so he felt compelled to ask, "Who told you Bai Wanjie was my senior? That is backward." "I am his senior," the girl said while looking at Han Sen angrily. Han Sen wanted to say something, but he saw Bai Wanjie do something just like the girl had predicted. He started to do something special. As Han Sen watched, the man selected an average member of the flower gods. And then, out of nowhere, Bai Wanjie pulled out a wine cup. He covered the flower god member with it, and then pulled him up. The flower god had been motionless and almost completely buried in the soil, but now Bai Wanjie was pulling him up little by little. His head and his neck were showing. Furthermore, the flower god's body didn't seem to be injured by the pull. He looked fine. Bai Wanjie kept on pulling. Soon after, the flower god's feet popped out of the soil. Many people turned to look at him. While everyone turned to observe the excavated flower god, the flower god opened his eyes. The flower on his head opened, and it exploded with a powerful substance chain. The creature jumped furiously at Bai Wanjia, who was the closest. Weird. I thought the flower gods didn't have deified elites. Han Sen was shocked. That flower god had substance chain powers that only a deified should have possessed.